Thank you for listening to Oregon Bend. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a single Wild Western adventure upload. Chapter 1. The Oregon sun, a molten coin in the vast bleached blue canvas of the sky, beat down on the raw timber and dusty thoroughfares of Bend. It was a town clawing its existence from the high desert, a place where the scent of pine resin from the mills mingled with the sharper tang of dust, horseflesh, and the ever-present undercurrent of stale beer and desperation wafting from the batwing doors of its numerous saloons. Wagons creaked, iron tires grinding against the packed earth, and the sporadic clang of a smithy's hammer punctuated the afternoon's simmering heat. Rip Campbell rode into this crucible of nascent civilization, not with a swagger, but with the quiet, coiled stillness of a man who had learned that survival often meant being the least noticed wolf in the pack. His horse, a deep-chested roan with the grit of long trails etched into its lean flanks, moved with a ground-eating gait that spoke of endurance. Campbell himself was cut from similar cloth. He was a man whose age was difficult to pinpoint. His face, shadowed by the brim of a stained Stetson, was a roadmap of hard miles and harder decisions, tanned to the color of old leather by sun and wind. His eyes, the gray of a winter sky before a storm, missed nothing, constantly sifting the ebb and flow of the street, the faces in doorways, the men lounging on boardwalks. A Colt peacemaker, its walnut grip worn smooth by long acquaintance, rode low on his right hip, tied down in the manner of a man who expected to need it in a hurry. He'd come to Bend for supplies, a brief respite before pushing further into the lonely, formidable country that lay eastward. He had no quarrel with the town, nor it with him, so he thought. But trouble, like a carrion bird, had a way of scenting Rip Campbell, no matter how low he kept his profile. He just exited the mercantile, the weight of a sack holding fresh coffee, beans, and a small tin of peaches a welcome burden when he saw him. Marshal Dan Lassiter. Lassiter was a man carved from granite and duty. He wasn't tall, but he possessed a solidity, a rootedness that made him seem larger than his physical stature. His vest was unbuttoned over a faded blue shirt, revealing the glint of a star pinned there, a small, potent symbol of the law in a lawless land. His face was square, sunburned, with a jaw that looked like it could crack walnuts, and his eyes, steady and direct, were currently fixed on Rip Campbell with an unwavering intensity. He stood near the corner of the assayer's office, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, not in a gesture of aggression, but of readiness. He knew Campbell. The recognition was stark and immediate in those unblinking eyes. And Campbell knew him, by reputation if not by sight, a lawman who didn't scare, didn't bribe, and didn't quit. A hush seemed to fall over their small section of the street. A dog, previously intent on a discarded bone, slunk away. Men who had been talking in low tones suddenly found reasons to move inside or further down the boardwalk. Campbell felt the familiar prickle on his neck, the tightening in his gut. He didn't alter his stride, didn't betray the sudden tension that sang through his nerves. He just continued towards his horse, hitched a few storefronts down. Campbell. Lassiter's voice was not loud, but it cut through the afternoon air like a honed blade. It wasn't a question, but a summons. Rip stopped. Slowly he turned, the sack of supplies still held in his left hand. He faced the marshal, his own expression unreadable. "Marshal," he acknowledged, his voice a low rumble. "Figured those posters out of Wyoming might have exaggerated," Lassiter said, his gaze never leaving Campbell's. "But I reckon not. You're a long way from Cheyenne, Rip." "A man's got a right to travel, Lassiter. Last I heard, this was still free country." Campbell's eyes flicked momentarily, taking in the marshal's stance, the way his right hand rested near the butt of his holstered Colt. "Free for some. Not so free for men with a price on their head for murder, bank robbery, and general hell-raising," Lassiter countered, his voice hardening. "I've got a warrant here, Campbell, duly sworn. Says you're to be brought in, dead or alive. I'd prefer alive, but that's largely your decision to make." The air crackled. Campbell could feel the sweat trickling down his spine, the oppressive heat suddenly more intense. He knew this dance. He'd danced it before. Warrants can be mistaken things, Marshal. Full of lies penned by frightened men. "This one feels pretty solid to me," Lassiter stated, his hand dropping a fraction closer to his gun. "Now, are you going to unbuckle that gun belt, or are we going to settle this in the dust?" Campbell weighed his options, a lifetime of such calculations flashing through his mind. Lassiter wasn't a man to be bluffed. Surrender meant a rope, or a slow death in some territorial prison. He'd sworn he'd never see the inside of another cage. His eyes, cold and hard as agates, met Lassiter's. The sack of supplies dropped from his left hand with a soft thud, kicking up a small puff of ochre dust. It was his only answer. The world seemed to explode in a heartbeat. Lassiter, for all his stocky build, moved with a speed that belied his frame. His hand blurred towards his holster, the practiced motion of 1,000 draws. But Rip Campbell had survived this long because he was more than just fast. He was instinct, honed to a razor's edge by a life lived on the precipice. Campbell's right hand was a tawny streak, sweeping down, fingers closing around the familiar, reassuring shape of his peacemaker. The oiled mechanism of the draw was a fluid, deadly ballet. Metal whispered against leather. The two guns roared almost as one, the concussions slamming against the storefronts, sending a flock of pigeons scattering from the eaves of the hotel. Dust kicked up between them as Lassiter's first shot went a fraction wide, splintering the wooden post Campbell had stood beside moments before. Campbell felt a searing, white-hot poker tear through his left side, just above the belt. The force of it spun him half around, a gasp torn from his throat. For an instant the street, the sky, the hard face of the marshal, all blurred into a kaleidoscope of pain and shocked surprise. He stumbled, his left hand instinctively clamping over the burning wound, feeling the sudden, slick warmth of blood. But even as the agony bit deep, his own gun was bucking in his hand. He'd fired on pure reflex, his sights aligning with the center of Lassiter's chest as he completed his draw. Through the haze of his own hurt, he saw the marshal jolt, a look of stunned disbelief flashing across his rugged features. Lassiter took a step back, then another, his own gun wavering. A dark stain blossomed on his blue shirt, spreading with alarming speed. He tried to raise his weapon again, a grimace of effort and pain twisting his lips, but the strength seemed to be deserting him. His knees buckled and he went down, first to one knee, then sprawling forward into the unforgiving dust of Ben's Main Street, his Colt clattering beside him. For a stretched second, Rip Campbell stood swaying, the acrid scent of burnt powder filling his nostrils, the roar of the shots still echoing in his ears. The fire in his side was a living thing, consuming him. He knew the wound was bad. He could feel the lifeblood pumping out, hot and urgent. He had to move. Ignoring the shouting that had erupted from onlookers, the doors now spilling curious and fearful faces, Campbell lurched towards his roan. Every step was an agony, his vision tunneling. He grabbed the saddle horn, his knuckles white, and hauled himself aboard. The horse, spooked by the gunfire, sidestepped nervously but held. He wheeled the roan, casting one last look at the fallen marshal, a still figure in the sun-baked street. Then, digging his heels into the horse's flanks, he sent it lunging forward, away from the town, away from the law, towards the vast, indifferent sanctuary of the open desert. Behind him, the sounds of Bend, the shouts, the running feet, the sudden horrified silence, began to fade as he galloped eastward, a wounded wolf fleeing into the wilderness, the taste of blood and dust bitter in his mouth. Chapter 2. Just a little further, blast it, Rip Campbell rasped, the words a dry friction in his throat. His own voice sounded distant, alien, nearly drowned by the rhythmic thunder of his roan's hooves against the sun-hardened earth. He was a man running, not just from the freshly spilled blood in Bend, but from a lifetime of shadows that clung to him like desert dust. Each league eastward was meant to be a league further from Marshal Dan Lassiter's still form and the accusing eyes of the townsfolk. Yet, distance alone couldn't erase the searing fire that clawed at his left side. The bullet had torn through him with vicious intent. It was a ragged, burning protest against his desperate flight. The roan, a beast of staunch heart and incredible stamina, responded to the pressure of his heels. It stretched its neck, ears flattened against the wind that Rip's own flight generated. The animal's breath came in great, shuddering gasps. Its coat, once a rich, dusty red, was now dark with sweat, lathered white where the reins and saddle leather rubbed. Campbell leaned low over its neck. He tried to become one with the horse, to minimize wind resistance, to urge it on with the sheer force of his will. The high desert of eastern Oregon unspooled around them. It was a vast, unforgiving tableau of sagebrush, juniper, and volcanic rock. The terrain was broken by sudden arroyos. These dry, sandy washes offered momentary concealment, but also threatened to snap a horse's leg with a misplaced step. Campbell used them when he could. He'd plunge into their dusty depths, follow their winding courses for a mile or two, then burst out onto the flats again, hoping to break the relentless line of his trail. He knew Lassiter was a popular man. A posse would be forming even now, if it wasn't already breathing down his neck. He risked a fleeting glance over his shoulder. The horizon behind him was a shimmering line of heat haze. There was no visible pursuit, but that meant little. A skilled tracker could follow a single horse across this arid expanse for days. He had to assume they were coming. The pain in his side was a relentless, throbbing drumbeat. He'd managed to stuff a strip torn from his kerchief into the wound, during a brief, jolting pause where the roan had snatched at a mouthful of dry grass. It was a poor substitute for a proper bandage. Already, he could feel the fresh, warm slickness soaking through his shirt again. His vision would swim at times. A cold sweat, unrelated to the desert heat, beaded on his forehead. He guided the roan with his knees, his hands occupied with clinging to the saddle horn and pressing against the fiery torment in his flank. He needed to think. East was the general direction, but a straight line was a fool's path when hunted. Nevada lay to the south and east. It was a wilder territory, less settled, with more places for a man to disappear. He veered the roan slightly southward, aiming for a distant broken line of hills that promised rougher country, harder tracking. As the sun climbed higher, becoming a merciless white fire in the sky, the heat and the blood loss began to take a more serious toll. A lightheadedness assailed him. The sagebrush seemed to waver and distort. It was in one of these moments, as the landscape shimmered like water, that the memory ambushed him. It came unbidden, sharp and visceral, triggered by the metallic taste of blood in his mouth and the burning ache in his side. He was younger then, not by much, but the lines on his face were fewer, his eyes perhaps a shade less haunted. He was holed up in a box canyon in the Arizona Strip. A posse, led by a vindictive rancher whose prize bull Campbell had accidentally rustled during a lean winter, had him pinned. For 3 days, they'd exchanged sporadic gunfire. His water was gone. His ammunition was dwindling. Campbell. The rancher's voice, amplified by the canyon walls, echoed like the crack of doom. We know you're in there. Thirsty, ain't ya? Hungry. Come on out, and we'll make it quick. He'd pressed himself flatter against the scorching rock. His lips were cracked. His tongue felt like a swollen piece of wood. He remembered the desperation, the feeling of the trap closing. He'd made a break for it, under the indifferent stars of a moonless night. It was a wild, chaotic scramble over loose rock, bullets whining past his ears, ricocheting off the canyon walls with angry, spitting sounds. One slug had plucked at his sleeve. Another had kicked dirt into his eyes. He'd reached his horse, a wiry buckskin then, and had ridden it into the ground, escaping by the thinnest of margins, leaving a trail of exhausted postmen cursing in his wake. But the fear, the raw primal terror of being cornered, had branded itself onto his soul. The memory dissolved, leaving Campbell trembling, the reins slick in his sweating palms. That was the feeling he had now. The walls of the world were closing in. He was a target, stark and solitary against the immense, uncaring canvas of the desert. The paranoia, always a quiet companion, now screamed in his mind. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, to take on the shape of a pursuing rider. Every gust of wind sounded like the distant drumming of hooves. He urged the roan onward, his voice a harsh croak. Faster, boy, faster. The line of broken hills that had been his southern beacon was closer now, perhaps another hour's hard ride. They offered the promise of shade, perhaps even water if he was lucky, and a maze of canyons to lose himself in. But the roan was faltering. Its powerful strides were becoming shorter, its breathing more ragged. The animal was giving him everything it had, but even the stoutest heart had its limits. Campbell knew he was pushing the horse too hard, knew he was risking its life as well as his own. But the alternative, the image of Lassiter's men appearing on his back trail, was a spur more potent than any steel. As they crested a low rise, the panorama of the desert spread before them once more. And then he saw it. Not behind him, but far off to the southeast, almost directly on his intended path to those sheltering hills. A thin, almost invisible plume of dust rose against the crystalline sky. It was faint, easily missed by an untrained eye. But Rip Campbell's eyes were far from untrained. It could be anything. Wild horses, a prospector, even a dust devil forming in the heat. But it was too steady, too purposeful. His gut, honed by years of such moments, clenched into a cold knot. It was riders, and they were positioned to cut him off from the very hills he sought for refuge. Chapter 3. Can't be a prayer meeting, Rip Campbell growled, his voice a harsh rasp against the sudden tightness in his chest. He squinted at the distant, telltale finger of dust. It was too deliberate, too steady against the vast, indifferent blue. That's a posse, or my name ain't trouble. His heart, already laboring, seemed to hammer against his ribs. The southern hills, moments before a beacon of grim hope, now shimmered with menace. They were cut off. Those riders, whoever they were, had the angle on him. To continue south was to ride straight into their teeth. He hauled on the reins, the movement sending a fresh stab of agony through his wounded side. The roan, its great chest heaving, stumbled slightly as it fought for purchase on the loose scree. Easy, boy, Rip soothed, his own breath coming in ragged bursts. Not your fault. My own damn luck. North. The thought was a desperate lunge in the dark. North lay the Grande Ronde Valley, and beyond that, Idaho-Washington territory. It was wilder country, less traveled than the routes to Nevada. But it was also a longer, harder path, especially for a wounded man with a failing horse. There was no choice. To stay was to be caught. To go south was to be caught. North was the only sliver of a chance left. He wheeled the roan, the faithful beast responding with a groan of effort. The horse was nearly spent. Its head hung low, and a tremor ran through its powerful frame with every exhalation. Each step was now a visible struggle. Rip felt a pang of something akin to sorrow for the animal. It had carried him bravely, unflinchingly, away from the hell of Bend. Now, he was riding it into the ground. The hours that followed were a blur of relentless movement and deepening misery. The sun, their tormentor, climbed to its zenith and began its slow, mocking descent towards the western horizon. Rip's wound throbbed with a life of its own, a fiery coal embedded in his flesh. Fever was coiling through him now. It brought with it a chilling cold that shook him despite the desert's furnace heat, followed by waves of burning delirium where the sagebrush twisted into grotesque, accusing shapes. Hunger, a hollow ache at first, had become a gnawing beast, tearing at his insides, making him light-headed and weak. He'd lost his sack of supplies back in Bend, a careless casualty of the gunfight. Now, the oversight was exacting its brutal price. He rode slumped in the saddle, clinging to consciousness by a thread. He talked to the roan, rambling, sometimes coherent, sometimes not. He spoke of cool water, of green pastures, of anything to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. The horse, as if understanding, plodded onward, its loyalty a heartbreaking testament to its spirit. Late in the afternoon, as the shadows began to stretch like grasping fingers across the land, the terrain began to change. The harsh desert scrub gave way to rolling hills, then to slopes dotted with ponderosa pine. They were entering the southern reaches of the Grande Ronde Valley. It was a vast, sweeping expanse of grassland and timber, a stark contrast to the arid wastes they had just traversed. For a moment the sight of it, the scent of pine and damp earth, revived Rip's flagging spirits. But the roan could go no further. With a shuddering sigh that seemed to rack its entire body, the horse stumbled, its forelegs buckling. Rip, caught by surprise, was thrown clear, landing heavily on his wounded side. A black wave of agony washed over him, and he cried out, the sound swallowed by the immensity of the valley. He lay there for a long moment, the dust motes dancing in the slanted sunlight, the world a dizzying, painful whirl. The roan lay on its side, its breathing shallow, its eyes glazed with exhaustion. It was done. With a monumental effort, Rip pushed himself to his knees. He was shaking, his vision blurred. He had to have a horse. To be afoot in this country, wounded and hunted, was a death sentence. He scanned the valley, his gaze desperate. Fortune, or perhaps just another twist of fate's cruel humor, offered a sliver. Nestled in a fold of the hills, not a mile distant, was a small, solitary cabin. A thin tendril of smoke curled from its stone chimney. Beside it stood a rough pole corral. And in that corral were horses. Hope, sharp and urgent, lanced through Rip's despair. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying. He offered a last, regretful look at the fallen roan. "Sorry, partner," he whispered. Then, driven by the primal urge to survive, he began the agonizing trek towards the cabin. Each step was a torment. His side felt like it was tearing apart. But the sight of those horses drew him onward. As he neared, he dropped into a crouch, using the scattered pines and boulders for cover. He could see 3 horses in the corral. 2 were sturdy-looking ranch stock. The third was a lean, raw-boned bronco, its hide the color of buckskin, its eyes wild and watchful. It had the look of an animal that had only recently known the sting of a rope and the confinement of fences. It would be tough to handle, but it also looked like it could run forever. There was no sign of life around the cabin. He waited, every nerve stretched taut for what seemed an eternity. The silence was broken only by the sigh of the wind in the pines and the distant call of a hawk. He couldn't wait any longer. The sun was dipping low, and darkness would bring its own perils. He moved quickly then, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper gloom of the trees. He reached the corral fence, his Colt already in his hand, not for the horses, but for any man who might suddenly appear. The raw-boned bronco watched him, its ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Rip unlatched the gate, his movements economical despite the fire in his side. He slipped inside. He just laid a hand on the bronco's rough mane, feeling the tremor of wild energy beneath his touch, when a voice shattered the stillness. "Hold it right there, friend. That horse ain't yours." Rip froze. His head snapped up. Standing in the doorway of the cabin, not 20 yards away, was a tall, gaunt man. He was dressed in homespun, his face weathered and grim. In his hands, held with a grim familiarity, was a long-barreled Spencer rifle. Its dark round muzzle was aimed squarely at Rip Campbell's chest. The man's eyes were narrow, suspicious, and held no hint of welcome. Behind him, in the shadowy interior of the cabin, Rip thought he saw the pale face of a woman, her eyes wide with alarm. Chapter 4. "That horse ain't yours, friend," the gaunt man repeated, his voice flat and hard as a river stone. The Spencer rifle in his hands remained steady, its dark eye fixed on Rip Campbell's heart. "And you ain't in a position to argue the point." Rip Campbell didn't move. His hand was still on the raw-boned bronco's mane. The wildness of the animal, its bunched muscles and flared nostrils, seemed to transmit a desperate energy into his own failing body. He could feel the man's gaze, could almost sense the pressure of his finger on the trigger. His own Colt felt a million miles away. His side was a sheet of fire. "Mister," Rip said, his voice surprisingly calm, though it cost him an effort to keep it so. "My horse just gave out on me back a ways. I'm hurt. Got a price on my head, and a posse likely smelling my blood. I need this horse. I mean to pay for it, if you'll let me." He doubted he had much, but the offer had to be made. The man's expression didn't soften. "Pay with what? Promises? I've heard that tune before. Get your hand off that horse." Behind the man, the woman's pale face was a small, anxious moon in the cabin's gloom. Rip knew this was a bad turn. A very bad turn. He didn't have the strength for a fight, not with a rifle covering him. But he couldn't surrender. He couldn't stay. Then the bronco itself gave him his only chance. Spooked by the tension in Rip's hand, or perhaps by the smell of blood and fever that clung to him, the horse suddenly sidestepped, snorting, and bumped hard against Rip. It was enough. In that instant of distraction, Rip moved. He didn't go for his gun. Instead, he lunged with the horse, yanking its head to the side, and vaulted onto its bare back with a desperate, pain-fueled agility he hadn't known he possessed. "Hey!" the cabin owner yelled, surprised by the sudden movement. The bronco, unaccustomed to a rider and startled by Rip's rough mount, exploded into action. It bucked once, twice, its hooves thudding against the hard-packed earth of the corral. Rip clung on, his thighs screaming in protest, his wounded side an inferno. The Spencer roared. The bullet whined past Rip's ear, so close he felt the heat of its passage. It slammed into the corral fence with a vicious thwack, sending splinters flying. The bronco, already terrified, needed no further urging. It bolted for the still-open gate, a streak of buckskin fury. Rip flattened himself against its neck, offering the smallest possible target. He heard another shot, wilder this time, and then the homesteaders' receding curses as the bronco cleared the corral and plunged into the trees, heading north by instinct. The ride that followed was a nightmare. The bronco was strong, wiry, and possessed of a demonic energy, but it had no training. It fought him every step of the way, bucking, sun-fishing, trying to scrape him off against low-hanging branches. Rip, weak from blood loss and fever, somehow managed to stay aboard. He wedged his knees tight, his hands tangled in its coarse mane, and let the horse run, guiding it more by shifting his weight than by any direct control. The jolting motion was agony on his wound. Black spots danced before his eyes, and more than once he nearly lost consciousness. He pushed the bronco relentlessly northward, through the timbered hills of the Grande Ronde, and then out into more open country as they neared the Washington line. The landscape grew starker again. The air felt different, thinner. He knew, with a grim certainty, that the Snake River lay ahead. It was a formidable barrier, a last desperate hurdle before he could hope to lose himself in the wilds of Washington territory. His fever was raging now. He shivered uncontrollably, then burned as if caught in a grass fire. Hunger was a constant, gnawing emptiness. He had to get across the Snake. There was no other way. Late the next day, or perhaps the day after, time had become a meaningless, painful blur. He reached the river. It was a terrifying sight. The snake, swollen with late spring meltwater, was a wide, roiling torrent of muddy brown water. It churned and boiled, carrying with it whole trees, branches, and debris like a monstrous, hungry beast. The roar of it filled the air. He could see the ferry landing at Outlaw in the distance, a cluster of small buildings on the far bank. For a fleeting moment, he considered it. A ferry meant people, questions, perhaps even a telegraph wire that had already sung with news of Marshal Lassiter's death and the description of a man named Rip Campbell. No, he couldn't risk it. He remembered the postman's dust from before. They might even be watching the known crossings. He turned the Bronco upstream, away from Outlaw, searching for a place where the banks were less steep, where the current might be a fraction less savage. He found a spot eventually. It was a shelving bank of gravel leading down to a stretch of water that, while still terrifyingly wide and swift, looked marginally less chaotic than the main channel. The Bronco, lathered and trembling, its wild eyes rolling, sensed the danger. It balked at the water's edge, planting its hooves, refusing to move. Rip, beyond reasoning with the animal, beyond caring for its fear when his own was a cold serpent in his belly, drove his heels into its ribs with what little strength he had left. "Go," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "We go now." He urged it forward, inch by agonizing inch, until the water was swirling around its hocks, then its belly. The current tugged at them, a powerful, insistent hand. With a desperate snort, the Bronco lunged, and they were in. The shock of the cold water was like a physical blow. It stole Rip's breath, sent shudders racking through his fevered body. The current seized them immediately, pulling them downstream with terrifying speed. The Bronco, its eyes wide with terror, began to swim, its powerful legs churning, fighting against the relentless force of the river. Rip clung to its mane, his body submerged in the icy torrent. His wound screamed in protest as the cold water seeped into it. He fought to keep his head above the surface, gasping for air, the roar of the river filling his ears. Debris bumped against them. A large log, half submerged, swept past, nearly unseating him. He could feel the horse's panic, the desperate strain of its muscles. They were carried a long way downstream, tossed about like a piece of driftwood. Several times, the current threatened to pull them under. Rip's grip weakened. His vision grayed at the edges. He was losing the battle. The cold was seeping into his bones, a deadly numbness spreading through his limbs. He thought of Lassiter, of the posse, of the endless, weary flight. Maybe this was where it ended. Maybe fate had finally played its last cruel card. But some deep, stubborn ember of defiance still flickered within him. He would not die here. Not like this. He tightened his grip, buried his face in the Bronco's wet mane, and kicked his own legs feebly, trying to aid their desperate passage. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to make headway towards the far bank. It seemed an eternity before the horse's flailing hooves found purchase on a muddy bottom. With a last, shuddering effort, the Bronco hauled itself from the river, staggering onto a narrow strip of gravel on the Washington side. It stood there, head down, sides heaving, trembling violently from cold and exertion. Water streamed from its buckskin coat. Rip slid from its back, his legs collapsing beneath him. He lay on the wet gravel, gasping, the world a dizzying, tilting nightmare. They had made it. But the cost had been terrible. The Bronco took a few shaky steps into the desolate, rock-strewn landscape that stretched away from the riverbank. Then, with a low groan, its legs gave out. It sank to the earth, too exhausted to even try to rise again. Rip watched, his heart a cold stone in his chest, as the raw-boned horse lay still, its breathing shallow. He was alone again, stranded in an unknown, hostile land, the treacherous river at his back, and the stolen horse, his last desperate hope, now little more than a dying beast at his feet. Chapter 5. "Well, Bronc," Rip Campbell rasped, his breath catching on a shard of pain. He knelt beside the fallen buckskin, the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Washington badlands stretching away in every direction. "You gave it all you had. More than a man had a right to ask." The horse's sides gave one last, shallow heave, and then were still. Its wild eyes, once full of fire and fight, were now dull, staring unseeingly at the merciless sky. Rip touched the animal's cooling neck, a fleeting gesture. He was alone. Utterly and terrifyingly alone. Afoot, wounded, without food or water, in a land that looked like God had forgotten it, or perhaps had created it in a fit of anger. He pushed himself upright, a groan tearing from his lips. His left side was a solid mass of agony, radiating a searing heat that felt like it was consuming him from within. The bullet Marshal Lassiter had put through him days ago, was it only days? It felt like a lifetime, had left a foul passage. Now, it was a corrupted, suppurating torment, bathing his entire flank in fire at every jolt, every hesitant step. He took one step, then another, away from the dead horse. Each movement was a fresh wave of nausea and pain. The badlands near Palouse Falls were a cruel mockery of sanctuary. Jagged rock formations, like the broken teeth of some primordial beast, clawed at the sky. The ground was a parched, cracked expanse of baked earth and loose stone, dotted with stunted, thorny bushes that offered neither shade nor sustenance. There was no sign of game, no hint of drinkable water. Only the sun, a relentless, pitiless eye beating down from above. The next few days, or was it weeks? Time had lost all meaning, became a walking nightmare. He stumbled onward, driven by some stubborn, deeply buried instinct that refused to let him lie down and die, though every fiber of his being screamed for that final release. He had been without food now for what he guessed was 4 days, ever since losing his supplies in Bend. Sleep had been a fleeting, tormented visitor for what felt like 10. Short, nightmarish dozes, full of fevered dreams and sudden, terrified awakenings, were all his body could snatch. His wound festered. He could smell the foulness of it, see the angry red and purple inflammation spreading around the ragged tear in his flesh. It felt as if his whole left side was on fire, a constant, unyielding agony. His internal world became a chaotic landscape of its own. Thoughts of fate, a concept he'd long wrestled with, swirled through his delirium. Was he merely a pawn, pushed and prodded by an unseen, malicious hand? Or did some sliver of choice remain, even now, in this godforsaken wasteland? He remembered words from his youth, lost from a wagon train, a scared boy alone in a vast, indifferent world. He recalled the rough freighter who'd given him his last name, and the gambler in Abilene who'd inadvertently given him his first, Slick, after a run-in with a tough Texas rancher. Those names, those events, seemed to belong to another man, another lifetime. Sometimes, in his fevered state, he saw Marshal Lassiter's face, stern and accusing. Other times, it was the gaunt homesteader with the Spencer rifle, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. He'd reach for his Colt, only to find his hand clumsy, his mind unable to distinguish memory from the harsh reality of the present. He saw cool, clear water shimmering just ahead, only to have it dissolve into heat haze as he stumbled towards it. He cursed the phantoms, cursed his luck, cursed the unyielding cruelty of the land. He was driven, goaded by that same brutal, heartless fate he felt had hounded him for all his 40-odd years. The cards were shuffled and dealt, he'd always believed. All he could do was play out the hand. But this hand felt like the very last. On what he vaguely registered as the 10th day since Bend, or perhaps the 4th day since the bronco had died beneath him, he reached his breaking point. The sun was a blinding inferno. The rocks shimmered. His tongue was a swollen, dry thing in his mouth. His legs, weak and trembling, finally refused to obey his will. He pitched forward, sprawling onto the hot, unforgiving earth. This was it, he thought, a strange sense of calm washing over him. The end of the road. He'd run out of tricks, run out of luck, run out of strength. He closed his eyes, a sigh escaping his cracked lips. The fire in his side still burned, but even that seemed distant now, muffled by a gathering darkness. Let it come. Let the buzzards have him. It would be a relief. He lay there for a long time, drifting in and out of a hazy consciousness. The sun beat down. Insects buzzed. The silence of the badlands was profound, broken only by the ragged sound of his own breathing. Then, through a momentary parting of the veils of pain and delirium, his eyes fluttered open. He was lying on a slight rise, a jumble of weathered boulders offering a sliver of meager shade. His gaze, unfocused at first, drifted towards the distant horizon. And he saw it. At first, he thought it was another hallucination, another cruel trick of his fevered mind. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of blue, far off in the distance, nestled in a crease of the desolate brown hills. It was different from the mirages. This had a depth, a substance that the phantoms lacked. Water. The word formed in his mind, a distant echo of hope. Could it be real? Or was it just another torment, a final, mocking jest before the darkness claimed him completely? He stared, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, trying to clear his vision. The shimmer remained. It was miles away, an impossible distance for a man in his condition. But it was there. A tiny spark, an ember he'd thought long extinguished, flickered deep within him. The will to survive, battered and nearly broken, stirred once more. Water. If he could reach it. If he could just drag his wretched, broken body that far. He tried to push himself up, his arms trembling like aspen leaves. A groan of pure agony was torn from him, as his wounded side protested. He fell back, panting, the effort nearly costing him the last of his reserves. But the sight of that distant blue, that improbable promise of life, held him. It was a lifeline, however frayed, however tenuous. He had to try. He had to. With a primal growl, a sound more animal than human, Rip Campbell began to move. He couldn't stand. He could barely crawl. But he clawed at the baked earth with his raw fingers, dragging his useless legs behind him, his eyes fixed on that far-off shimmer of blue. Every movement was an excruciating torture. Every inch gained a monumental victory against the encroaching void. Chapter 6. Water. The word was a cracked whisper, a dry leaf skittering across Rip Campbell's parched soul. His hands, raw and bleeding, clawed at the loose scree and baked earth. His legs, unresponsive, dragged behind him like dead weights. Each pull, each agonizing yard gained was a monumental effort, a testament to a will that had somehow impossibly refused to snap. The distant shimmer of blue had been his only focus for what felt like an eternity of torment. It had wavered in his vision, sometimes vanishing behind curtains of heat haze or waves of fevered delirium, only to reappear, a stubborn beacon in the desolate, sun-hammered badlands. Now, after an age of crawling, of dragging his broken body over the unforgiving terrain, it was close. He could smell it. A faint, damp, slightly alkaline scent carried on the hot breeze. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline that bordered on madness, he scrabbled over a low ridge of crumbling rock. And there it was. Not a mirage this time. Not a cruel trick of his dying mind. A lake. A small pothole lake, its surface a startling, improbable turquoise against the drab browns and grays of the surrounding coulee. A choked sob escaped him. He half fell, half slid down the short embankment, his body giving out as he reached the water's edge. He lay there for a moment, panting, his face pressed against the damp, cool mud. The relief was so profound, it was almost a new form of pain. Then thirst, a raging inferno within him took over. He plunged his face into the water, heedless of its quality, and drank. He drank in great, shuddering gulps, the liquid surprisingly cool against his swollen tongue. It was brackish, with a distinct alkaline bite that puckered his mouth. Tiny waves lapped against the shore, leaving a faint residue like soap suds. He knew this water wasn't pure. It would likely eat the bottom out of a tin cup within a year. But to Rip Campbell, at that moment, it was the sweetest nectar he had ever tasted. It was life itself, seeping back into his desiccated frame. He drank until his shrunken stomach protested, then forced himself to stop, knowing too much too fast could kill him. He lay back, panting, the coolness of the water a blessed balm. After a while, he gathered the strength to sit up. He looked at his hands, caked with dried blood and grime, his nails broken and torn. He was a ruin of a man. Slowly, painfully, he dipped his hands into the lake again and began to wash his face. The alkaline water stung his raw skin, but it was a cleansing pain. He scrubbed at the layers of dust and sweat, feeling small patches of his own tormented flesh emerge from beneath the filth. He splashed water over his matted hair, trying to sluice away some of the grime. He even dared to let a little water run over the inflamed, fiery mess of his wounded side, hissing as the minerals bit into the corrupted tissue. He had no mirror, not anymore. His blanket roll, with its few meager possessions, was long gone, lost with one of the horses that had carried him on this desperate flight. But he could imagine his reflection. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, his skin stretched tight over his skull, his beard a wild, unkempt thicket. A scarecrow. A specter. Less a man than a hunted animal run to ground. A flicker of something, a distant memory of self-respect, stirred within him. He was Rip Campbell. He'd been called evil, from Dodge City to Death Valley. But he'd also been a man who, in his own rough way, had standards. This current state, this was a degradation. He rested by the water's edge for a long time, letting the initial shock of relief and the small act of cleansing seep through him. The sun was beginning to dip towards the rugged western horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air cooled slightly. He felt a marginal return of strength, though the fire in his side still raged, and the hunger gnawed relentlessly. His gaze, no longer solely fixed on the immediate, desperate need for survival, began to wander. He took in the details of the coulee. It was a sheltered spot, the walls rising steeply on three sides. Stunted jack pines clung to the rocky slopes. Sagebrush, gray-green and fragrant, grew in clumps. It was then, as his eyes scanned the eastern wall of the coulee, that he saw it. At first, he wasn't sure. It was set back, tucked into a grassy chute that led down from the prairie above, almost a part of the landscape itself. But the lines were too regular, too deliberate to be natural. A house. Or something like it. The front was made of pine logs, freshly cut by the look of them, their surfaces still shiny. The spaces between the logs were daubed with clay. The back of the structure was the earth itself, the sheer wall of the chute. It was half a dugout, half a cabin. Primitive, but solid. New. Beside it, pulled to one side as if to make room, stood a homesteader's wagon. It was a big Studebaker, its canvas cover stretched over hoops to form a makeshift tent. A silent testament to hope, to dreams of taming this harsh land. Rip stared, his mind slowly processing the implications. People. Civilization, of a sort. After days of brutal solitude, of wrestling with death in the wilderness, the sight of that dwelling sent a strange, conflicting tremor through him. It meant the possibility of food, of help. It also meant danger, questions, the potential for betrayal. His eyes, sharper now after the water and the brief rest, continued to scan the area around the cabin. And then he saw him. A small figure, moving near the wagon. A child. A boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, absorbed in some solitary game, occasionally brandishing a stick like a rifle. The sight of the child, an emblem of innocence in this raw, untamed land, struck an odd chord deep within Rip Campbell. An obscure, almost forgotten impulse surfaced. Before he approached, before he risked revealing himself, there was something he had to do. He, Rip Campbell, the notorious gunman, the fugitive with a price on his head, felt a sudden, inexplicable need to look a little less like the half-wild beast he had become. He turned back towards the lake, his gaze searching for a smooth, still patch of water that might serve as a crude mirror. His hand went to the remnants of his belt, fumbling for the small oilskin pouch he always kept tied there, a last holdout from his lost possessions. It held his razor. The impulse was strong, undeniable. He had to try. Chapter 7. "Hurts like the devil himself is ussin' my hide for a whetstone," Rip Campbell muttered under his breath. He'd done what he could. The cold, blunt edge of his razor, scraped dry against skin already tormented by sun and fever, had been an agony. Alkaline water from the pothole lake did little to soothe the fresh nicks that now oozed tiny beads of blood, mingling with the grime he couldn't quite scrub away. He still looked like a man who'd wrestled a grizzly and lost, but perhaps, just perhaps, the worst of the animal savagery had been scraped from his face. It was a faint hope, a desperate concession to a forgotten human instinct. He rose slowly, every muscle screaming in protest, his wounded side a burning inferno. The sun, though beginning its descent, still cast a formidable heat across the coulee. He had to approach the cabin. The thought of food, of any kind of sustenance, was a siren song, drawing him forward despite the inherent risks. People meant unpredictability. They meant questions he couldn't answer, dangers he might not be able to fend off in his weakened state. But starvation and infection were sure and certain death. He moved with the ingrained caution of a hunted wolf, keeping low, using the sparse cover of stunted jackpines and outcroppings of rock. His Colt Peacemaker was loose in its holster, his thumb brushing the worn grip, a familiar comfort in an uncertain world. The rifle he'd carried from Bend was long gone, lost with the first horse. Now the Colt was his only tooth. As he drew nearer, the sounds of the homestead became clearer. The gentle sigh of the wind through the coarse grass, the distant caw of a crow, and then the unmistakable sounds of a child at play. He could see the boy more clearly now, near the big Studebaker wagon. The lad was perhaps 9 years of age, a shock of sun-bleached hair falling across his brow as he aimed a stick, making soft pow-pow noises at some unseen enemy. Rip paused at the edge of a small cluster of sagebrush, 100 feet or so from the wagon. He didn't want to startle the boy too badly, though his appearance alone was likely to do that. He took what he hoped was a non-threatening step into the open. The boy, in the midst of charging an imaginary foe, froze mid-stride. His make-believe rifle clattered to the dusty ground. His eyes, bright and surprisingly perceptive in a young face, widened as they fixed on Rip. They flicked from Rip's dirt-caked, blood-streaked face to the ominous shape of the Colt tied low on his hip, then to the lean, desperate hunger that must have been carved into every line of Rip's frame. The boy stood painfully still, a small statue of sudden apprehension. Rip raised a hand slowly, palm open. "Easy there, son," he said, his voice raspy, foreign even to his own ears after days of disuse. "Didn't mean to spook you." The boy swallowed, his gaze still locked on Rip's gun. He said nothing. "Your pa home, boy?" Rip asked, keeping his tone gentle. He needed to know who he might be dealing with. The boy's eyes, for the briefest of moments, flickered towards the vast empty horizon to the west, then darted back to Rip. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but to a man like Rip Campbell, who lived by reading such subtle signs, it spoke volumes. The man of the family was gone. Away. Or perhaps gone for good. The boy set his small jaw, a miniature echo of adult defiance, and remained silent, his fear warring with a nascent protectiveness. "What is it, Jesse?" a woman's voice called out, sharp with an undertone of anxiety. It came from the cabin, the half-dugout structure Rip had observed from the lake. Rip turned his head slowly, so as not to make any sudden moves that might alarm the boy further. He saw her then, standing in the leather-hinged doorway. She was a pretty woman, as the fading light caught the strands of blonde in her hair. Not yet 30, he guessed, though the harshness of this land, the sun and the wind and the ever-present loneliness, had already begun to etch their story onto her face, stealing some of the vibrancy from her blue eyes and the gold from her hair. She was wiping her hands on an apron, a gesture of domesticity that seemed strangely out of place against the raw backdrop of the wilderness and the clear present tension. Beside her, leaning just inside the doorframe, within easy reach, Rip could see the twin-blued barrels of a shotgun. Its presence was as potent as any spoken word. This woman was no helpless prairie flower. She was a survivor, ready to defend her own. "What is it?" she repeated, her voice sharper now, her gaze sweeping from her son to fix on Rip with an intensity that was both fearful and challenging. Her eyes took in his tattered clothes, his gaunt face, the way he favored his left side, the dark stains that spoke of more than just dirt. "Are you one of Bear's riders?" The name Bear hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Rip had heard it before, back when he'd stumbled upon that first homesteader family, the ones who had given him beans and cornbread. Bear, the local cattle king, the one pushing settlers off the land. Rip touched the greasy brim of his hat, a gesture more of habit than respect. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice still rough. "I'm a stranger in these parts. Plumb new to this country." He paused, letting his own desperate weariness, his undeniable hunger infuse his next words. "And I'm near starved, ma'am. I'd take it as a most kindly act if you'd be willing to sell me some victuals. I ain't got much, but I can pay." Her eyes, those faded blue pools, went over him again, a slow, meticulous inventory. Rip could almost see himself as she must, a dirty, scar-faced man, likely smelling of old blood, stale sweat, and the faint foul odor of his festering wound. Fresh razor nicks on his mottled gray skin probably looked like fresh wounds themselves. He knew what he looked like. He'd seen enough hard cases in his time to recognize the brand. He looked dangerous. He was dangerous, though right now he felt as weak as a newborn kitten. The silence stretched. The boy, Jesse, still stood frozen near the wagon, his gaze flicking between his mother and the ominous stranger. The shotgun remained a silent sentinel by the door. Rip Campbell waited, his own life, or at least the chance for another meal, another day, hanging on the judgment in this woman's tired, wary eyes. He could feel the last of his strength beginning to ebb, the effort of standing, of talking, of merely existing, becoming an almost unbearable burden. Chapter 8. "You look like you've danced with the devil, and he stepped on your toes, mister," the woman finally said, her voice low and edged with a weariness that matched Rip Campbell's own. Her blue eyes, though faded, were sharp. They missed nothing of his sunken cheeks, the feverish glint in his gaze, or the way he unconsciously favored his wounded side. "What kind of trouble are you running from that leaves a man looking like that?" Rip didn't answer the question directly. He had no breath for lies, and the truth was a currency he couldn't afford to spend. "Trouble finds me, ma'am," he managed, his voice a dry rasp. "Or I find it. Either way, it leaves a mark." He met her gaze squarely, letting her see the raw desperation, the gnawing hunger that had stripped away all pretense. "That food you mentioned. I'd be grateful for it." She studied him for another long moment, the shotgun still a silent threat just inside her doorway. The boy, Jesse, remained a watchful statue by the wagon, his young eyes wide. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire unforgiving prairie, She gave a curt nod. "All right, mister. Step down a ways from the cabin, over by that there cottonwood stump. I've something left from Jess's dinner. Ain't much, but it might keep body and soul together a while longer." Relief, so potent it was almost sickening, washed over Rip. He nodded, a jerky movement of his head. "Obliged, ma'am. Deeply obliged." He moved slowly, carefully, towards the indicated stump. Each step was a fresh reminder of the fire in his side, of muscles screaming in protest. He didn't want to alarm her further with any sudden movements. He was keenly aware of the shotgun, of her unwavering gaze. He eased himself down onto the rough surface of the stump, the effort leaving him breathless and trembling. Jesse, seeing the stranger settled, took a tentative step closer, his earlier fear now visibly warring with a boyish fascination. His eyes were fixed on the worn butt of Rip's Colt Peacemaker. Rip saw the look. He'd seen it before, in the eyes of boys on dusty streets from Abilene to El Paso. Guns held a fatal allure for the young, a promise of power and adventure they couldn't yet comprehend. Rip himself had no particular feeling for children. He couldn't rightly remember ever having been one, not in the carefree way Jesse seemed to embody, despite his current apprehension. Rip's own youth had been a brutal tutorial in survival. He'd been Jess's age, maybe a year or two older, when he'd been driving a creaking freight wagon across the plains, his hands raw from the reins, his belly often as empty as it was now. Childhood was a luxury he'd never known. Even now, as he sat waiting, a supplicant dependent on the charity of this prairie woman, his old habits didn't desert him. His eyes, narrowed against the glare of the setting sun, scanned the rim of the coulee, noting the shadows, the possible lines of approach, the places a man might hide. He was a long way from the Missouri River bottomlands where his life had begun its hard, twisting journey, but some things never changed. He was still hungry, still dirty, and still wary of the kick that would surely come if he wasn't quick enough on the dodge. His mind, loosened by hunger and fever, drifted back. Campbell. That was the name a rough-handed freighter had given him, plucked from the filthy back alleys of St. Louis where he'd been living like a starved wharf rat. He'd had no other name then, none he could remember. The freighter had worked him half to death, but had also fed him, taught him the rudiments of survival on the trail. Then there was the name whispered in dusty saloons and around nervous campfires, Rip. Not Slick. He'd never been slick. Rip Campbell. That moniker had been branded on him, in a smoke-filled cantina in a forgotten border town south of the Gila. A card game, a cheat exposed, and a blur of motion that left two men bleeding onto the sawdust floor, their surprise etched permanently onto their dead faces. He hadn't started that fight, but he'd sure as hell finished it, his hideout .41 Derringer making a bloody punctuation mark. From that day on, Rip Campbell had a reputation. Fast. Deadly. Cold-blooded. The reputation had grown with each passing year, each new town, each desperate confrontation. He was a man to be feared, a man to be avoided. He wondered if this woman, out here in the vast emptiness, had ever heard of Rip Campbell. If she had, if she knew the man who now sat so humbly on her woodpile, that shotgun would likely already be spitting fire and buckshot. The woman emerged from the cabin again. She carried a tin plate heaped with what looked like beans and a chunk of cornbread. The aroma, humble as it was, reached Rip's nostrils and twisted his guts into a knot of ravenous desire. His mouth watered uncontrollably. "It ain't much," she said, her voice still cautious, but perhaps a fraction less harsh than before. She stopped a few feet away from him, clearly unwilling to come too close. "But it's what I have to spare." "I can eat out here, ma'am," Rip said, not wanting to push his luck, not wanting to enter her home and make her feel more threatened than she already was. She hesitated, her gaze flicking from Rip to Jesse, who had edged closer still, his eyes glued to the plate of food. "No," she said after a moment, a decision made. "It ain't right for a man to eat on a stump like a coyote, no matter what. Come in. Sit down at the table." Rip Campbell looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his fevered eyes. He hadn't expected that. He pushed himself slowly to his feet, the effort a fresh wave of agony. The shotgun still leaned by the door, he noted. But for now, at least, an invitation had been offered. He took a step towards the cabin, towards the promise of food, and a moment's shelter from the vast, uncaring wilderness that had nearly claimed him. The scent of beans and cornbread was the most beautiful perfume he had ever known. Chapter 9. "Table's over in the corner, mister," the woman said, her voice still holding a careful distance. She gestured with her chin towards a rough-hewn construction of split logs. "It ain't fancy, but it's sturdy enough." Rip Campbell nodded, his throat too tight with anticipation of the food to manage more words. He moved with a slow, deliberate shuffle into the dim interior of the dugout. The air inside was cooler than the sun-baked coulee, thick with the scent of packed earth, wood smoke, and the overwhelmingly seductive aroma of cooking beans. Light filtered in from the single small window and the open doorway, revealing a space that was cramped, meager, yet surprisingly clean. A rough bunk was built into one wall. A few pots and pans hung from pegs. The furniture, what little there was clearly homemade, fashioned from the same split cottonwood as the table. It spoke of relentless toil, of making do with scraps and determination. He eased himself onto a low stool beside the table, the movement sending jolts of fire through his wounded side. He clenched his teeth against the pane, his gaze sweeping the small dwelling. It was the kind of place he'd seen 100 times before, sprinkled across the vast, unforgiving territories of the West. Homesteaders, always chasing a dream, always pitting their sweat and hope against insurmountable odds. An old irritation, sharp and familiar, pricked at him. These people, with their stubborn refusal to accept the harsh realities of a stacked deck, always stirred a strange mix of pity and annoyance in his gut. They wouldn't listen to reason. They'd just keep battering themselves against the unyielding wall of fate until it broke them. The woman placed the steaming tin plate in front of him. Beans, thick and dark, alongside a generous slab of cold cornbread. A faint, sweetish odor of molasses mingled with the savory scent of the beans, a fragrance so potent it made Rip feel weak-kneed, almost dizzy with ravenous hunger. For days he had dreamt of food, hallucinated banquets, only to wake to the gnawing emptiness of starvation. Now, salvation was before him. He didn't hesitate. Manners were a luxury for men with full bellies and untroubled minds. He seized the knife that was his constant companion, the only utensil he owned besides his fingers, and began to shovel the beans into his mouth. The food was hot, savory, substantial. It was the most exquisite meal he had ever tasted. He ate in a steady, unbroken rhythm, barely pausing for breath, his focus entirely on the plate, on assuaging the desperate, clawing hunger that had tormented him for so long. He didn't slow until the last bean was gone. Then he used the cornbread to sop up every last trace of the rich juice from the tin plate. Only when the plate was wiped clean did he become aware of the silence in the small dugout. He looked up, a little dazed. The boy Jesse was staring at him, his young eyes wide with a mixture of awe and undisguised shock. "Ma!" Jesse exclaimed, his voice an urgent, scandalized whisper. "He eats with his knife." The woman flushed, a tide of embarrassed color rising in her cheeks. "Hush, Jesse," she said, her voice sharp with mortification. Then to Rip, "I apologize, mister. It's hard to teach manners to a boy out here with just—" Her voice trailed off. Jesse, undeterred, piped up again. "I bet he's one of Bear's riders. They're all hogs." "Jesse," the woman admonished, truly flustered now. I'm awful sorry, mister. He speaks his mind, this one does. Rip managed a faint smile, a bleak, fleeting flicker of expression that barely touched his lips. No harm done, ma'am, he said, his voice a little stronger now with food in his belly. Reckon the boy's right about the knife part, anyway. Nobody learned me much different, till I was too old to change my ways. He felt a surprising warmth, an unfamiliar flush of embarrassment himself, and was suddenly keen to shift the focus of the conversation. This bear you mentioned, who might he be? The woman's expression changed. The brief embarrassment was replaced by a familiar shadow of worry and resentment. Bear, she said, her voice hardening. He's the thorn in the side of every sodbuster in this county. She paused, gathering her thoughts, then continued. This land here, this whole stretch, used to be Indian Reserve. Bear, he's a big cattleman. He used to pay the tribes $1 an acre to run his herds on it. Said it was his by right of use. She poured herself a tin cup of water from a bucket in the corner, her movements economical. Then the government threw it open for filing. For homesteaders. Like us. Bear, he aims to keep it all for himself. He's brought in every hard case and tough nut they've run out of Lewiston and Walla Walla to make sure of it. Ain't there a sheriff in the county? Rip asked, keeping his tone neutral, though his interest was anything but. The woman gave a short, scornful laugh. Sheriff. The word was an epithet on her tongue. He's Bear's man, bought and paid for. The county commissioners, they're all big cattlemen themselves, friends of Bear. When the old sheriff died last spring, a good man he was, tried to be fair, the commissioners, they up and appointed this new fella. Does whatever Bear tells him. Rip nodded slowly, absorbing the information. I see, he said, the words calm, betraying nothing of the sudden cold knot that had formed in his stomach. A sheriff. A bought sheriff. That was the last kind of lawman, a man like Rip Campbell, a man on the run with a fresh killing behind him, and a reputation as long and dark as a winter night, ever wanted to cross paths with. He looked down at his empty plate, the brief respite offered by the food already overshadowed by the familiar weight of a world rigged against the underdog, a world where power made its own rules. The taste of beans and cornbread suddenly seemed less sweet. Chapter 10. Reckon I've troubled you folks enough, ma'am, Rip Campbell said, pushing himself up slowly from the rough-hewn table. The single plate of beans and cornbread had done wonders, dulling the sharpest edges of his hunger, lending a thin trickle of warmth and strength to his battered frame. That food, it likely saved my life. I'm grateful. The woman nodded, her expression still guarded, but the fear in her blue eyes had lessened somewhat, replaced by a deep, abiding weariness. A Christian body couldn't do less, mister, seeing the state you were in. She glanced towards the door, then back at him. This ain't a safe place for a man alone, especially one who looks to be on the run. Rip knew she spoke the truth. The information about Bear and his bought and paid for sheriff had settled like a cold stone in his gut. This Colfax County was a hornet's nest, and he was walking right into it. He looked at the woman, at the boy Jesse who now stood silently by her side, and a familiar irritation mingled with a grim sort of pity welled up inside him. They were so damn stubborn, these homesteaders, clinging to their patches of dirt, their impossible dreams in the face of men like Bear. They couldn't see the futility of it, couldn't see that the deck was stacked against them from the start. They had no chance at all, not really. They'd just be ground down, another forgotten tragedy on the vast, indifferent prairie. He reached into the small, worn pouch that hung from his belt, the one that had miraculously survived his ordeals. His fingers closed around a coin. It was a half-eagle, a significant sum. He held it out to her. The woman's eyes widened slightly. She shook her head, a quick, almost involuntary movement. No, mister. I couldn't take that. It was just a plate of beans. Ma'am, Rip insisted, his voice quiet but firm. You fed a stranger. A dangerous-looking one at that. You showed kindness when you had every right to be afraid, to turn me away or use that scattergun I saw by your door. He pressed the coin into her hand, closing her fingers over it. You take it. For your trouble. For Jessie. She looked down at the gold piece, then back at him, a conflicted expression on her face. Finally, she nodded slowly. Thank you, mister. Rip gave a curt nod in return. He turned to leave the dim confines of the dugout, to step back out into the fading sunlight. Jessie trailed after him as he moved away from the cabin, the boy's earlier apprehension now almost entirely replaced by an unabashed curiosity. The lad's eyes were fixed, not on Rip's face, but on the bone handle of the Colt Peacemaker that rode on Rip's hip. You like guns, boy? Rip asked, pausing a short distance from the cabin, the question softer than he'd intended. Jess's eyes lit up. Yes, sir. I got $1 saved up, he announced proudly. He looked straight at Rip, his young face earnest. You want to sell that gun, mister? Rip almost smiled. The boy had grit. Afraid I couldn't rightly get along without this one, son, he said, his hand instinctively resting on the familiar grip. It's seen me through a tight spot or two. What do you need a gun like that for? Jessie pressed, his gaze unwavering. Before Rip could answer, the boy rushed on, his imagination taking flight. Maybe the Indians will come snooping around. Or I could shoot that bear fella, and his whole gang of mangy riders too. Pop says they're no-account varmints. A dry chuckle escaped Rip's lips. It was a rusty, unused sound. Whoa there, young fella. That's a mighty big fight you're looking to pick. He looked down at the boy, at the fierce determination in his young eyes, and felt an unexpected pang, a fleeting connection. You saved that fight, boy, he said, his voice a little gravelly. You just might need it someday. He gave the boy a final nod, then turned his face to the north. The vast, rolling expanse of the Palouse hills beckoned. He started walking, his pace slow but steady, the fire in his side a dull, constant ache now instead of a searing flame, thanks to the food and the brief rest. He didn't look back immediately. There was no point. They were a small, fragile island of hope in a sea of impending trouble, and he was just a piece of driftwood, passing briefly through their lives. As the sun began to dip below the western horizon, casting long purple shadows across the land, the character of the country started to change. The rough, broken badlands gave way to deep, fertile soil. Wild grass, tall and abundant, rolled in waves before the evening breeze, brushing against his hips as he walked. It was rich country, this Palouse. Beautiful, in its own wild way. But every step was an effort. His body, though temporarily fueled, was still a wreck. Just as true dusk was settling, a sage hen, plump and unwary, scurried across his path, dragging a wing in a feigned injury, trying to lure him away from her hidden chicks. Rip's eyes, however, were fixed on the hen herself. He was still hungry, the beans and cornbread a temporary reprieve, not a solution. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand. The shot was quick, economical. The sage hen crumpled, a puff of feathers marking its demise. He glanced at the nearby fluff balls that were her chicks. They looked old enough to scatter and fend for themselves. Survival was a harsh mistress. Before full darkness enveloped the land, he found a small, sheltered depression near the Palouse River. He gathered a few dry limbs and, with some difficulty, managed to get a small fire going. He spitted the sage hen on a green stick and roasted it over the flames. The meat was tough, stringy, and tasted strongly of the sage it had fed on. But it was hot, and it was protein. He ate every scrap, gnawing the bones clean. Supper over, he doused the small fire carefully. He had no horse to pick it, No saddle to use as a pillow, no blanket to ward off the night's chill. He found a spot with his back against a sun-warmed rock, the ground still holding a faint trace of the day's heat. He loosened his Colt in its holster, his hand resting near it even as exhaustion began to pull at him like a powerful tide. The vast, star-dusted sky arched overhead, cold and remote. With the taste of sage and ashes in his mouth, Rip Campbell closed his eyes and, despite the pain, despite the uncertainty of the morrow, fell into a profound, stone-heavy sleep. Chapter 11. You can quit playing possum, Campbell. Right now, you're cold turkey. The voice was sharp, faintly amused, and cut through the deep fog of Rip Campbell's exhaustion like a shard of ice. Rip's eyes snapped open. For a disoriented second, he didn't know where he was. The last thing he remembered was the profound, heavy oblivion of sleep, his back against a rock, the taste of singed sage hens still in his mouth. Now, the first silver tendrils of dawn were creeping over the eastern rim of the coulee, painting the undersides of the clouds in ghostly hues of gray and pink. A preternatural stillness hung in the air, the kind that often precedes violence. He felt it instantly, a cold prickle on his skin, a tightening in his gut. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He hadn't moved, not so much as a muscle, but his right hand, which had been resting near his holstered Colt, instinctively tightened its grip. His thumb found the familiar curve of the hammer. The voice came again, closer this time, still laced with that unsettling amusement. Don't even think about it, Rip. Not unless you're partial to more holes than you already got. Rip. Not many men knew that name. Fewer still used it to his face, and lived to tell the tale. Rip sat up slowly, every movement a carefully controlled effort, his body protesting with a symphony of aches and the familiar throbbing fire in his side. As he rose, he tried to tilt the barrel of his Colt subtly towards the sound of the voice, but it was a futile gesture. I wouldn't, the voice warned, flat and suddenly devoid of humor. Standing not 15 feet away, silhouetted against the brightening sky, was a man. Or rather several men, all mounted, all holding rifles with a grim readiness. But it was the man in the lead who held Rip's attention. He was short, wiry, sitting his horse with a cocky assurance. A carbine rested easily in the crook of his arm, its muzzle centered squarely on Rip's chest. A mirthless grin played on his lips, though his eyes were cold and hard as river pebbles. Rip pulled his hand away from his pistol, letting it rest limply at his side. He knew when a hand was played out. Shorty Moorcross, he said, his voice a dry croak. Recognition had dawned, unwelcome and dangerous. I ain't seen you since that mess in Wyoming. The short man's grin widened, though it still didn't reach his eyes. The name's Dyke, Rip. Ted Dyke. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Shorty Moorcross, he never quite made it out of Wyoming, if you catch my drift. He tapped his chest with a thumb, and for the first time, Rip noticed the glint of a tin star pinned to his dusty vest. Fact is, Ted Dyke is the duly appointed sheriff of Colfax County. Rip Campbell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn air. Sheriff. Shorty Moorcross, a two-bit road agent and sometime rustler, was now wearing a badge. The irony was so thick, so bitter, it almost choked him. I must be dreamin', Shorty, he said, shaking his head as if to clear it. Or maybe that bullet in my side scrambled my wits more than I thought. You said, Sheriff. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of this new, lethal configuration of fate. Shorty Moorcross. He remembered him from a dimly lit, smoke-filled saloon in a Wyoming boomtown. A braggart, a small-time operator, always looking for an angle, always a step or two ahead of the hangman's noose, or so he boasted. Now, that same weasel was a lawman, holding a carbine on him. If there was a price on Rip Campbell's head, and Rip had no doubt there was, especially after Bend, Shorty wouldn't hesitate to collect it. He wouldn't waste time with a trial, not if the reward was big enough. That's right, Rip. Sheriff Dyke. Shorty, or Dyke, as he now called himself, seemed to savor the words, savor the look of stunned disbelief on Rip's face. Times change. People change. Or at least, their names and occupations do. Rip said nothing. He could feel the tension coiling in his own muscles, the instinct to fight, to resist, screaming through his veins. But he also knew it was hopeless. Dyke was no greenhorn with a firearm. He'd seen Shorty handle a gun before. He and his men had Rip cold. They could put 3 bullets through him before he could even clear leather, especially in his current weakened state. Still, the thought of surrender, of being caged, was a bitter pill. Dyke must have seen the flicker of defiance in Rip's eyes. His grin tightened. Don't get any foolish notions, Rip. You were always fast, I'll give you that. But you ain't faster than a carbine slug at this range. And my boys here, he gestured with his head towards the other grim-faced riders, they're just itching for some target practice. Rip let out a slow breath, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. The trap had been sprung. He'd walked right into it, too exhausted, too focused on his own misery to sense the danger, until it was too late. The woman at the dugout. Bear, a bot sheriff. It all clicked into place, with sickening clarity. Colfax County. He should have known. He should have smelled the rot. Well, Sheriff Dyke, Rip said, the title tasting like ash in his mouth. Looks like you got me. Dyke's grin returned, full of smug satisfaction. He shifted slightly in his saddle, the carbine never wavering from Rip's chest. That I do, Rip. That I do. He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting Rip stew in his own predicament. Then his voice dropped, taking on a conspiratorial, almost thoughtful tone. Campbell, he said, deliberately using the more common name now. You're in a mighty bad spot. Chapter 12. A mighty bad spot, Campbell, Sheriff Ted Dyke repeated, the faint pre-dawn light etching deeper shadows into his weasel-like face. His carbine remained rock-steady, its muzzle a dark, unwavering eye fixed on Rip's chest. No doubt about that. A man like you, turning up in my county, looking like he's been chewed up and spit out by a cougar, well, it does raise questions. Rip Campbell met Dyke's gaze. His own eyes narrowed, betraying nothing of the turmoil within. Hope was a dangerous thing, a flickering candle in a hurricane, but the fact that Dyke was talking, not shooting, was a sliver of something. Don't see too many ways out when a man's looking down the barrel of a rifle, Dyke. Unless you're planning to jaw me to death. Dyke actually chuckled, a dry, grating sound. Still got that sharp tongue, eh, Rip? Some things never change. He paused, his expression turning thoughtful, almost speculative. But maybe you're wrong. Maybe there is a way out. Could be, for both of us. Rip waited, every nerve ending tingling with a mixture of suspicion and a desperate nascent hope. He knew Shorty Moorcross, or Ted Dyke, as he now insisted, was no philanthropist. If there was an offer coming, it would have strings attached, likely woven from barbed wire. This Colfax County, Campbell, Dyke began, his voice taking on a confidential tone. It ain't what it used to be. It's getting crowded. Homesteaders, mostly. Scum, most of 'em, thinking they can just walk in and claim land that ain't theirs for the taking. He spat on the ground. Right now, we're looking over every strange rider that comes through. Most times, we just issue a polite request to keep on riding, if you catch my drift. Rip remained silent, his face a mask. He knew this game. Dyke was setting the stage. Now, a man with your particular set of skills, Dyke continued, his eyes glinting, he could be real useful. Or he could be a real big problem. He shifted the carbine, almost imperceptibly. I'm giving you a chance here, Campbell. A good chance, considering the alternatives. We could just forget we ever saw each other before. Leastways, forget that name, Rip Campbell. Say your name is Jake Brown. Sounds respectable enough, don't it? He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. Fact is, Jake, I find myself in need of a good deputy. Just for a month or so. Someone who ain't afraid to get his hands dirty. Someone who knows how to handle difficult situations. Rip felt a wave of astonishment, so profound it nearly buckled his knees. A deputy. Him. Rip Campbell, a man with more notches on his gun than he cared to count, wearing a tin star. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Yet, beneath the shock, a different sensation was spreading through him, warm and unexpected. Relief. Pure, unadulterated relief. It was like cool water pouring over a parched and burning landscape. It wasn't freedom, not by a long shot. But it wasn't a noose, and it wasn't a bullet in the brain. A deputy, ha! Rip said, his voice carefully neutral, though his heart was hammering. That'd be a new way of livin' for me. He met Dyke's gaze. You got a dodger on me, Sheriff Dyke. A wanted poster with my face on it. Dyke grinned, a flash of teeth in the gloom. Probably get one in a couple of days, after you ride out of whatever hole you crawled from. I must say, Rip, I'm surprised at you. In the old days, a man couldn't get within a gunshot of where you were sleeping, let alone walk right up and tap you on the shoulder. A wry, humorless smile touched Rip's lips. We all get old, Dyke, he said, the weariness in his voice profound. For a minute there, I was thinking I wasn't going to get any older at all. Happens to the best of us, Dyke conceded. He gestured with his carbine. All right, Deputy Brown. One of my boys will find you a horse. We ain't got all day. As one of the riders dismounted and approached with the reins of a spare mount, Dyke continued. Now, there's someone you need to understand about in this county. The law here answers to one man, mostly. His name is Bear. He's a big rancher, got his fingers in just about everything. He jerked his head. We'll be riding by his spread on our way to town, so you can see how the land lies. Rip swung himself carefully onto the offered horse, a rangy sorrel with a mean eye. His wounded side screamed in protest, but he bit back the groan. He looked at Dyke. I never knew the time you needed help from anyone, Shorty. A sheriff, he said, testing the waters. Dyke's eyes narrowed for a moment at the slip. Then he relaxed slightly. A man can't have eyes everywhere, Campbell, he admitted. These homesteaders, they're like ants. Stubborn. And some of them are pretty tough. They'll fight for this rich land. He paused, then gave Rip a look that was both knowing and predatory. You might say you're insurance for me. Just like I'm insurance for Mr. Bear. He gathered his reins. All right, men. Let's ride. He spurred his horse forward, his men falling in around him, effectively boxing Rip in. Rip Campbell, now answering to the name Jake Brown, a newly minted deputy sheriff in a county run by a cattle baron, and a corrupt lawman he knew from a less savory past, turned his horse and followed. The sun was beginning to crest the eastern hills, painting the sky in bold strokes of orange and crimson. It was a new day. And for Rip Campbell, it was the beginning of a very strange, very dangerous new hand in a game he couldn't afford to lose. Chapter 13. There she is, Deputy Brown, Sheriff Ted Dyke said, a sweep of his hand indicating the sprawling collection of buildings cresting a low hill ahead. His voice held a note of proprietary pride, as if showcasing a personal achievement. The Bar B. Bear's Kingdom. Rip Campbell, now ostensibly Jake Brown, narrowed his eyes. Even from a distance, the place radiated an aura of raw power and grim preparedness. It wasn't just a ranch, it was a fortress. As they drew closer, splashing their horses across a shallow ford of the river that snaked through the valley floor, the details sharpened, confirming Rip's initial assessment. A blacksmith was hard at work in an open-fronted shed, the rhythmic clang of his hammer echoing in the clear morning air. The man didn't pause in his labor, but a Winchester rifle leaned conspicuously against the stone forge, well within his reach. Near a large corral, 3 men were busy repairing cinch straps and other tack. They worked with an air of casual industry, yet behind them, propped against the corral fence, were 3 more rifles. These were new, Rip noted, their blued steel gleaming in the sunlight. These weren't idle ranch hands, they were soldiers. The main house itself was an imposing structure, set back against the protective shoulder of the hill. It was constructed of heavy fieldstones, mortared together with a solidity that spoke of permanence and defiance. A full-length porch stretched across its front, offering a commanding view of the entire valley, a perfect vantage point from which to observe any approach. Higher up, on the rim of the hill behind the house, more riders were visible, hazing a small bunch of horses, their figures stark against the skyline. Rip took it all in, his gaze missing nothing. The Bear Ranch was coiled like a rattlesnake, ready to strike. It would take a small army to breach these defenses, to challenge the man who ruled this domain. He wondered again what kind of hornet's nest he'd stumbled into, and what role Dyke truly expected him to play in the violent drama that was clearly brewing. As they rode up towards the corral, one of the men tinkering with the tack stopped his hammering. He casually picked up his rifle and began a meticulous inspection of its mechanism, his eyes, however, fixed on the approaching sheriff and the stranger beside him. He was a lean, hard-bitten man with eyes the color of faded denim and a jaw that looked like it had been set in granite. Dyke reined in his horse, gesturing with a thumb towards Rip. "Mornin', Parker," he called out. "Got myself a new deputy. Name of Jake Brown." He smirked. "Jake, this here is Parker Nichols. He's the foreman of the Bar B." Nichols nodded slowly, his gaze moving over Rip with a cool, appraising scrutiny. It was the look of a man who had sized up countless others, weighing their potential for trouble or utility. He didn't offer a hand, nor did Rip expect him to. "Deputy, yes," Nichols said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He glanced at Dyke. "Bear up at the house." "Figured he'd be at the cook shack getting his breakfast," Dyke replied. Nichols grunted. "That he is." He jerked his head towards a long, low building situated a short distance from the main house, a plume of smoke rising from its chimney. "If Cookie's in a good mood, and that's a big if this early, maybe you can snag some grub yourselves." Rip's stomach, despite the beans and cornbread from the homesteader's wife, gave a hopeful rumble. The sage hen he'd eaten last night had been a meager offering against the gnawing hunger that had become his constant companion. "Appreciate that, Parker," Dyke said, touching the brim of his hat. He turned his horse, and Rip followed, leaving Nichols to his work and his weapons. The cook shack was a utilitarian structure, built for function rather than comfort. The smell of frying bacon and strong coffee wafted from its open door, a rich, inviting aroma that made Rip's mouth water. As they dismounted and tied their horses to a hitching rail, Rip took another slow look around. Every man they'd passed, every visible hand on the place, was armed or had a weapon close by. There was an undercurrent of tension, a sense of coiled readiness that was palpable in the very air they breathed. This wasn't just a ranch, it was an armed camp. Dyke pushed open the door to the cook shack and strode in, Rip a step behind him. The interior was dim after the brightness outside, filled with the clatter of pans and the sizzle of cooking meat. A large, sweat-stained man in a flour sack apron presided over a massive wood-burning range, his face flushed from the heat. Several long tables were arranged in the center of the room, currently empty save for one. At that lone table, his back to the door, sat a man. He was broad-shouldered, with a thick neck and a head of coarse, reddish hair. Even from behind, He exuded an air of solidity, of unshakable authority. This, Rip knew instinctively, had to be Bear. The king in his castle, waiting for his tribute. The anticipation of the meeting, of facing the man who held this county in his fist, settled like a cold weight in Rip's belly, a sensation that had nothing to do with hunger. Chapter 14. "Mornin', Mr. Bear," Sheriff Ted Dyke called out, his voice a little too loud, a little too jovial in the smoky confines of the cookshack. "Hope we ain't interruptin' your breakfast too much." The broad-shouldered man at the table didn't turn immediately. He continued to saw at whatever was on his plate, a deliberate, unhurried motion that spoke of a man accustomed to making others wait. Finally, with a grunt, he swiveled in his chair. Rip Campbell got his first good look at him then. Bear was a heavy man, probably around 40, with a face the color of raw beef, flushed from either temper, whiskey, or both. His eyes were small, cold, and set a little too close together, giving him a piggish, discontented look. A thick, reddish mustache drooped over a wide, thin-lipped mouth. He surveyed Dyke, then his gaze shifted to Rip, lingering for a moment with open disdain. "What is it, Sheriff?" Bear's voice was a gravelly rumble, thick with irritation. "Can't a man eat his own grub in peace on his own land?" He speared a slice of ham from his plate. "Just a small matter, Mr. Bear," Dyke said, his tone placating. He gestured towards Rip. "This here is Jake Brown, the new deputy I was tellin' you about. Figured you'd want to meet him." Bear's cold gaze raked Rip up and down, a slow, contemptuous appraisal that took in the tattered clothes, the gaunt, scarred face, the barely concealed weariness. "He ain't much to look at, is he?" Bear said, not even bothering to lower his voice. He addressed Dyke, as if Rip wasn't even there. "Is he useful, Sheriff? Or just another mouth to feed?" Dyke forced a smile. "He'll get the job done, Mr. Bear. Guaranteed." Bear grunted again, unconvinced. He fixed Rip with that chilling, impersonal stare. "All right, Brown, is it? You and the sheriff here, you represent the law in this county. Or what passes for it." He took a large bite of ham, chewing with deliberate slowness. "I want those damn nesters off the Indian strip. All of 'em. I don't want 'em plowing up good grazing land. And I sure as hell don't want any federal marshal comin' down here from Spokane Falls, nosin' around after the fact." His eyes narrowed. "If you happen to be, shall we say, wanted in other states or territories, Brown, then you get this job done clean and quick, and then you get yourself gone from Colfax County. Understand?" Rip met his gaze, his own expression unreadable. "Understood, Mr. Bear." Dyke, sensing the tension, jumped in. "How about a little breakfast for us, Mr. Bear? Been a long ride." Bear scowled. "Don't anybody ever think to eat before they come all the way out here?" he grumbled. He waved a dismissive hand towards a side table. "Plates are over there. Help yourselves. Don't expect fancy." Rip's stomach, despite the meal from the homesteader woman and the stringy sage hen, was a hollow, aching void. The sight of ham and eggs, even if served with a side of Bear's contempt, was an irresistible lure. He moved to the side table, picked up a tin plate, and loaded it high with what was left of the ham and a congealing mass of fried eggs. He filled a thick mug with coffee from a large pot simmering on the back of the big range. The ham was already starting to dry out, and the eggs were greasy and cold, but it was food. He took the plate to an empty spot at another table, far from Bear, and drawing his knife, began to eat with the same ravenous intensity he'd shown at the homesteader's dugout. Bear pushed his own chair back with a scrape, stood up, and stretched. Rip, pausing to refill his coffee cup, noted the man's expensive attire. Choke-bore riding pants, hand-tooled boots. Even a short-barreled pistol, carried discreetly in a specially tailored hip pocket. This was a man who was used to wealth and power, and who wasn't afraid to display it or defend it. Bear grimaced as he watched Rip attack his food. "Sheriff," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "your new friend there might be a curly wolf in a fight for all I know. But he eats like a damned hog. Next time you bring him out here, feed him outside with the dogs. He turns my stomach." Rip's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly cold and hard as flint. The piece of ham, halfway to his mouth, stopped. He could feel the familiar, dangerous heat begin to rise in him. Before he could move or speak, Dyke was there, his hand clamping down on Rip's arm like a vice, quick as a striking snake. "Take it easy, Rip," Dyke hissed, his voice low and urgent, using the old dangerous moniker. "Not here. Not now." Rip's jaw tightened, but he held himself in check. He saw Bear staring at him, a contemptuous sneer on his face, but behind the bluster Rip caught it. A tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of nervousness in the big rancher's eyes. Bear was a bully, used to men cowering before him. He wasn't used to a man who looked back with the flat, deadly gaze of a rattlesnake. The moment passed. Bear snorted, turned on his heel, and strode out of the cook shack, leaving the scent of his arrogance lingering in the smoky air. Dyke let out a slow breath and removed his hand from Rip's arm. "Close one, Campbell. Real close." They finished their meal in a tense silence. Afterwards, outside in the bright sunlight, as they untied their horses, Dyke clapped Rip on the shoulder, a forced gesture of camaraderie. "Hell, Campbell," Dyke said, trying to sound unconcerned. "I wouldn't let what Bear said get under your skin. He's been top dog in this county for a long, long time. He just didn't know who he was talking to, that's all." Rip Campbell settled his hat low over his eyes, his face a bleak, unreadable mask. He swung up into the sorrel's saddle, the movement stiff and painful. He looked down at Dyke, his gaze as cold and empty as a winter grave. "Don't you worry about Bear, Sheriff," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "I never kill anybody, unless I'm paid for it." With that, he turned his horse, following Dyke's lead as they rode out of Bear's fortified ranch, heading towards the distant smudge on the horizon that was Palouse City. The chilling words hung in the air between them, a stark reminder of the kind of man Ted Dyke had just pinned a tin star on. Chapter 15. "Well, Brown, that dusty collection of shacks and false fronts ahead is Palouse City," Sheriff Ted Dyke announced, gesturing with a lazy wave of his hand. His tone was flat, unimpressed. "Ain't exactly Cheyenne, but it's where we hang our hats. Or at least, where I hang mine." Rip Campbell, riding beside him as Jake Brown, said nothing. He merely narrowed his eyes, taking in the settlement as they approached. It lay sprawled in a wide, fertile valley, the two branches of the Palouse River meeting just beyond its ragged edge. A single main street, rutted and dusty, served as its artery, lined with a familiar assortment of frontier businesses. A general store, two saloons with optimistic names, a livery stable, a blacksmith shop belching smoke, and a few scattered dwellings that looked more like temporary shelters than permanent homes. It was a town like a dozen others Rip had seen, raw and new, clinging precariously to life on the edge of the wilderness. Their ride from Bear's fortified ranch had been largely silent. Rip's chilling remark about only killing for pay had cast a pall over any attempt at casual conversation Dyke might have considered. Rip himself was content with the quiet. His mind was busy processing the morning's events, Bear's blatant arrogance, Dyke's oily subservience, and his own strange new role as a hired gun wearing a tin star. The irony wasn't lost on him, but irony wouldn't fill his belly or heal the festering wound in his side. Dyke led him directly to a small, unpainted clapboard building near the center of town. A crudely lettered sign above the door proclaimed, "Sheriff, Colfax County." Inside, the office was small and sparsely furnished, a scarred wooden desk, two rickety chairs, a gun rack holding a couple of shotguns and an old Spencer, and the inevitable pot-bellied stove, cold now in the late spring warmth. Wanted posters, some new, some yellowed and curling at the edges, were tacked haphazardly to the walls. Rip scanned them quickly, a reflex born of long habit, but saw no likeness of himself among them. Not yet, anyway. "You can bunk down at the livery for now, Brown," Dyke said, slumping into the chair behind his desk. "There's a couple of empty stalls in the back with reasonably clean straw. Better than the ground you were on last night, I reckon." He fished a tarnished star from a drawer. "Here. Pin this on. Makes it official." Rip took the badge. It felt heavy, alien in his hand. He pinned it to his borrowed shirt, the cheap metal a stark contrast to the worn fabric. "Obliged, Sheriff." "Report back here after you get yourself settled," Dyke said, already dismissing him. "We'll talk more about your duties then." Rip nodded and left. At the livery barn, a hulking, one-eyed ostler grunted him towards the back. He found an empty bunk, little more than a wooden frame with some burlap sacking stretched across it, but it was a bed of sorts. Exhaustion, deep and profound, finally claimed him. He stretched out, his wounded side screaming a protest, and fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep that lasted through the afternoon. When he awoke, the late afternoon sun was slanting through the dusty cracks in the livery walls. His body ached with a vengeance, and the coppery taste of fever was strong in his mouth. But the hours of sleep, however rough, had cleared some of the fog from his brain. His first thought was of cleanliness. He was caked in days of trail dust, dried blood, and the sweat of fever. He found a barber shop down the street, a small, cluttered establishment smelling of bay rum and hair tonic. For 4 bits, he bought a hot bath in a tin tub behind a faded calico screen. The water was scalding at first, but gradually, blissfully, it soothed his aching muscles. He soaked for a long time, the grime of his desperate journey dissolving into the gray water. He carefully cleaned his wound, hissing as the hot water and harsh soap bit into the inflamed flesh. It looked angrier than ever, purple and swollen, emitting a faint, foul odor. He knew it needed more than just a bath. It needed a doctor, poultices, rest. But those were luxuries he couldn't afford. For now, the hot water would have to suffice. His old clothes, stiff with dirt and blood, felt alien and repulsive against his newly clean skin. He gave a young boy who was sweeping the barbershop floor 2 bits to run to the general store and fetch him a new pair of denim overalls and a plain cotton shirt. While the boy was gone, he had the barber give him a close shave and trim his shaggy hair. The feel of the sharp razor against his skin was a welcome sensation, another layer of the trail's harshness being stripped away. Dressed in his new clean clothes, his face smooth, his hair tamed, Rip Campbell felt almost human again. He smelled faintly of new denim and the barber's bay rum. The transformation was more than just physical. It was a shedding of a skin, a step away from the hunted animal he had become. He was still Rip Campbell underneath, the man with a dark past and a dangerous present. But on the surface, for now, he was Jake Brown, a man looking for a fresh start, or so anyone might think. His stomach rumbled, reminding him that the meal at Bayer's Ranch had been hours ago. He found a small eatery tucked between a saloon and a saddle shop. The air inside was thick with the smell of frying meat and coffee. He ordered a steak, fried potatoes, and a wedge of apple pie, and ate with a quiet, focused satisfaction. It was the best meal he'd had in weeks, a solid, reassuring presence in his belly. As evening began to fill the dusty streets of Palouse City with plum-colored light, Rip Campbell, cleaned, shorn, and fed, felt a measure of his old strength returning. The weariness was still there, a deep ache in his bones, and the fire in his side was a constant throbbing reminder of his brush with death. But he was alive, and he had a purpose, however distasteful, however dangerous. He pushed his empty pie plate away, paid the apron proprietor, and stepped back out into the cooling air. The tin star on his chest felt strange, a foreign weight. He touched it briefly, a grim smile playing on his lips. Deputy Jake Brown. It was a role he'd never imagined playing. He squared his shoulders and began to walk towards the sheriff's office, towards Ted Dyke, and whatever fresh hell this new day had in store for him. Chapter 16. Sheriff Dyke, Rip Campbell said, his voice flat as he stepped into the cramped, smoke-hazy interior of the sheriff's office. The setting sun cast long, angular shadows through the dusty window, painting stripes across the rough wooden floor. "You wanted to see me." Ted Dyke looked up from his scarred desk. A half-empty whiskey bottle and a single dirty glass stood at his elbow. He favored Rip with a grin that was all teeth and no warmth. "Ah, Brown. Or should I say, Deputy Brown." He chuckled. "Scrubbed up tolerable, I see. Almost look like a respectable citizen." His gaze flicked to the two other men lounging in the small office, then back to Rip. "Come on in. Meet the rest of Palouse City's finest." Rip's eyes, already accustomed to the dim light, quickly took the measure of the other two so-called lawmen. One was a portly fellow with a florid face and a booming voice that seemed too large for the small room. He was in the middle of recounting some loud, self-aggrandizing tale, gesturing expansively with a meaty hand. His name, Rip would soon learn, was Walters. He had the bluster of a man who talked a better fight than he fought. Rip pegged him instantly, a blowhard full of hot air and cheap whiskey, the kind who would likely fold like a wet sack of flour when the lead started flying. The other man was his opposite. He was big, heavy-shouldered, with a brooding, stolid presence. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his thick chest, his expression dull, almost bovine. This was Spear, Dyke informed him with a wave of his hand. Spear had been the town marshal before Dyke's appointment, a man more suited to manhandling drunks out of saloons than engaging in any kind of nuanced police work, let alone a gunfight. Rip sized him up as the muscle, the one they'd use to physically intimidate and rough up any homesteaders who got out of line when they came into town. Slow-witted, probably, but strong enough to be a problem in a brawl. Neither man looked like he'd be much use in a real scrap. Rip felt a familiar sense of isolation settle over him. He was on his own, even when surrounded by supposed allies. "All right, boys, listen up," Dyke said, pushing his chair back and rising to his feet. He swaggered a little as he paced the small space, relishing his role as the man in charge. "Here's the deal for tonight, and for the foreseeable future." His gaze settled on Rip. "Brown here will be joining you two on patrol." Walters, his story interrupted, looked Rip up and down with a mixture of curiosity and ill-concealed disdain. Spear just grunted, his expression unchanging. "Now," Dyke continued, his voice dropping to a more conspiratorial tone, "we all know Mr. Bayer's concerns regarding these nesters flooding into the county. Saturday's comin', and that means the town will be full of 'em. Some of Bayer's riders will likely be in town too, letting off a little steam." He paused, a sly grin spreading across his face. "They might get a little boisterous. Might be inclined to be a bit tough with some of these sodbusters." Rip listened, his face impassive, though a cold knot was tightening in his gut. He knew where this was going. He'd seen this play before, in other dusty towns under other corrupt regimes. "Most of these farmers," Dyke went on, his grin widening, "they won't cause no real trouble. They're married men, got wives and young'uns to think about. They can't afford to fight, not really. They'll swallow their pride, take their lumps and scurry on home." He stopped his pacing and looked directly at Rip, his eyes glittering with a cold, calculating light. "But there's always one or two, ain't there? Young bucks full of piss and vinegar. Think they're tough. Or maybe they just got a hankerin' to impress their lady friends." He chuckled again, a humorless sound. "Those are the ones we need to discourage. Permanently, if need be." His gaze flicked to Walters and Spear, then back to Rip, lingering. "Spear, you and Walters, you try to keep a lid on things generally. But if any of these young farm boys decide they want to be heroes, if they decide to push back hard." He let the sentence hang in the air for a moment. "Well, those are the men we'll leave to Deputy Jake Brown here." He winked. "That clear, Brown?" Rip Campbell met Dyke's gaze, his own eyes as cold and hard as a winter frost. He understood perfectly. He was the ringer, the enforcer, the man brought in to do the dirty work that Dyke and his other so-called deputies hadn't the stomach or the skill for. He was Bayer's hired gun, plain and simple, given a tin star to make his killings legal, or at least justifiable in the eyes of whatever skewed justice prevailed in Colfax County. It was a familiar role, one he'd played before, though never with a badge pinned to his chest. The irony was as bitter as gall. He thought of the woman at the dugout, of young Jesse with his fierce, naive desire to fight Bear. He thought of their stubborn hope, their pathetic little homestead. They were the ones he was now being paid to crush, to eliminate, if they dared to stand up for themselves. "Clear as mud, Sheriff," Rip said, his voice flat, devoid of expression. Dyke grinned, mistaking Rip's impassivity for assent. "Good. That's what I like to hear." He waved a dismissive hand. "All right then. Town's yours for the night. Keep your eyes peeled. And Brown," he added, his voice dropping slightly, "try not to scare all the paying customers out of the saloons with that death mask face of yours, eh?" Rip didn't grace the jibe with a response. He merely nodded, his gaze sweeping over Walters and Spear once more. Blowhard and Bruiser. Some welcoming committee. He felt the weight of the cheap tin star on his chest, heavier now than any Colt he'd ever strapped on. He turned and walked out of the smoky office, Spear and Walters shuffling after him, into the deepening twilight of Palouse City. The night was young, and it promised to be long and ugly. Chapter 17. "All right, Deputy Brown," Walters boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow alleyway they'd just stepped into. He hitched up his gun belt with a self-important air. "Since you're the new wolf in this here sheep pen, where do you reckon we point our noses first?" Saloons are usually where the trouble starts, or ends, depending on how you look at it. Rip Campbell, walking a few paces ahead, didn't break stride. "You boys know this town better than I do," he said, his voice flat. "I'll just follow your lead. Try to stay out of your way." He had no intention of getting entangled in Walter's bluster or Spear's plodding presence any more than necessary. The night air of Palouse City was cool after the day's heat, carrying the mingled scents of wood smoke, stale beer, dust, and the faint sweet fragrance of prairie grass from beyond the town's ragged edges. Yellow lamplight spilled from the windows of the two saloons, the Wild Spur and the Dusty Rose, painting lurid patches on the darkened street. Tinny piano music, punctuated by occasional bursts of raucous laughter or angry shouts, drifted out, a familiar soundtrack to countless nights in countless frontier towns. Walters, predictably, steered them towards the saloons, eager to bask in the reflected authority of his badge and perhaps snag a free drink. Spear lumbered along beside him, his heavy gaze sweeping the street with a dull, methodical lack of interest. Rip fell back, letting them take the lead, preferring the deeper shadows near the boardwalks. He moved with a quiet, ghost-like tread, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing, missing nothing. He saw a few weary-looking homesteaders loading supplies into a wagon, their faces etched with worry. He saw a group of swaggering young men, likely ranch hands from one of the outlying outfits, their spurs jingling as they headed for the promise of whiskey and female companionship. He saw the usual collection of night owls, furtive figures darting between buildings, a lone dog sniffing at a pile of refuse, a painted woman watching from a darkened doorway. After an hour of this charade, Rip found himself drifting away from his two colleagues. They were more interested in preening and soaking up the saloon's atmosphere than in any serious patrolling. He let them be. His own path took him down the length of the main street, past the last flickering lamppost, to where the two branches of the Palouse River flowed together at the town's southern edge. Here, the sounds of the town faded, replaced by the gentle, ceaseless murmur of water flowing over stones. It was a peaceful sound, a clean sound, a stark contrast to the manufactured gaiety and underlying menace of the street he'd just left. He stood there for a while, letting the night breathe around him. Then he heard it, a deeper, more resonant sound, a booming rush like a distant waterfall. He listened intently for several minutes, puzzled, before he finally identified its source. It wasn't falling water. It was the wind, a steady, powerful river of air, sweeping over the vast, unseen acres of head-high grass that grew up on the rim of the valley. That grass, he thought, it told a story. This Palouse soil, if it could nurture wild grass to such astonishing height, would grow wheat beyond any farmer's wildest dreams. It was rich land, impossibly fertile. And men like Bear, for all their power, for all their hired guns and bought and paid for sheriffs, couldn't hold back the tide of settlement forever. It was inevitable. The farmers would come, drawn by the promise of this black earth. They would keep coming, wave after wave, until the entire valley was a patchwork of cultivated fields. Bear's resistance was ultimately futile. Rip knew that with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. It was only the first ones, the pioneers, the stubborn, hopeful fools like the woman at the dugout and her boy Jesse, who would suffer the most. They were the ones who would break the ground, who would face the brunt of Bear's violence. Those who came after them, when the land was a little more tamed, a little less lawless, they would find courts and churches, and perhaps even impartial sheriffs. And his role in this grim, unfolding drama? He was the hammer, the hired gun with a tin star, brought in to crush the first green shoots of resistance. He was the instrument of Bear's will, wielded by Dyke. The thought left a bitter, coppery taste in his mouth, like old blood. It was an old story, one he'd seen play out time and again across the westward sprawl of the nation. The names changed, the faces were different, but the brutal mechanics of it, the greed and the violence, remained depressingly the same. He was caught in it, a cog in a machine he despised but couldn't escape. He thought of the gunfights to come. A professional gunman, another man who lived by the Colt, he didn't truly fear. That was a known quantity, a deadly game of nerve, speed, and hairline calculations about another man's reactions. No, it was the amateurs he had to worry about, the greenhorns. Some desperate farmer, his hands calloused from the plow, not the pistol grip, who had never before aimed a weapon in anger. A man like that, driven by fear or rage or the need to protect his family, might get lucky. A wild shot, a clumsy draw that somehow found its mark. That was the kind of unpredictable danger that could get a man killed. A chill wind swept down from the rim, rustling the tall grass, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. Rip Campbell shivered, though not entirely from the cold. He turned his back on the whispering river and the sighing grass and began the slow walk back up the crooked street, towards the livery stable and his rough bunk. The night was quiet for now, deceptively so. But tomorrow was another day, and Saturday, with its inevitable influx of homesteaders and Bear's hard cases, was looming. Violence was coming to Palouse City. It was as certain as the sunrise. And he, Rip Campbell, alias Jake Brown, was slated to be right in the bloody heart of it. Chapter 18. A low groan escaped Rip Campbell's lips, a sound wrenched from the depths of his fevered body. Damn this fire. Damn this ache. He shifted on the rough bunk in the livery stable, every movement sending fresh waves of torment through his joints, through the burning inferno in his side. He blinked his eyes open to a cloudless Saturday morning. The sunlight, usually a welcome sight, streamed through the dusty cracks in the barn wall in accusing, brilliant shafts. It seemed to mock his misery. The brief respite he'd felt the afternoon before, after the bath and the meal, had vanished completely. Now, a bone-deep ache permeated his entire frame. A steady, throbbing headache pulsed behind his eyes, and the coppery foul taste of fever was thick on his tongue. His motions were sluggish, his thoughts clouded. He knew, with a grim certainty, that the infection in his wound was winning. He had to see a doctor. The thought of revealing his weakness, of exposing his vulnerability in this town where he was supposed to be a figure of intimidation, was galling. But the alternative was a slow, agonizing slide into a fevered grave. Rip Campbell had faced death many times, but he wasn't ready to surrender to it in a filthy livery bunk. He pushed himself upright, his teeth clenched against the pain. Dressing in his new, still stiff overalls and shirt was an ordeal. Each movement was a calculated effort. Once outside in the already warming air of Palouse City, he spotted a young boy listlessly kicking a stone in the dusty street. "Son," Rip called out, his voice raspy. "You know if there's a doctor in this town?" The boy looked up, eyes wide at Rip's haggard appearance. He pointed a grubby finger down the street. "Doc Weatherby. Lives in that house yonder. 4 doors down, with the sorta green paint peeling off." Rip nodded his thanks and shuffled off in the indicated direction. The doctor's house was easy enough to spot. It was a small, slightly dilapidated clapboard structure, indeed with paint peeling from its weathered boards. On the porch, seated in a creaky rocking chair and absorbing the morning sunshine, was a man. He was untidy, with the stains of his morning coffee prominent on his shirt front, and a fringe of gray hair escaping from beneath a battered hat. This had to be Doc Weatherby. The doctor looked up as Rip approached, his gaze surprisingly keen despite his disheveled appearance. "Mornin', friend," he said, his voice amiable. "Something I can do for you? Or are you just enjoying the fine sunshine like me?" "Doc Weatherby?" Rip asked. "The same. And you are?" "Name's Brown. Jake Brown." Rip gestured vaguely to his left side. "Got myself a bit of trouble here. A bullet wound. Not healing too well." The doctor's amiable expression faded, replaced by a more professional concern. "Well, let's have a look then, Mr. Brown. Come on inside." Inside, the house was cluttered but clean, smelling faintly of carbolic acid and old books. The doctor led him to a small examining room. With surprisingly gentle hands for a man of his rough appearance, he helped Rip remove his shirt. Doc Weatherby took one look at the angry, purplish, and swollen gash in Rip's side and let out a low whistle. He didn't poke or prod, for which Rip was grateful. Instead, he looked sharply into Rip's eyes, then took his wrist and checked his pulse. "My friend," the doctor said at last, his voice grave, "you are in mighty bad shape." He shook his head. "This wound is poisoned, badly. You've got a raging fever. You do any more strenuous activity with that thing in your side, and you'll likely fall out of your saddle for good." He peered at Rip again. "Fact is, you've got a powerful lot of poison working through your whole system right now." Rip absorbed the news stoically. It was no more than he'd suspected. "What do you reckon, Doc?" "Reckon you need to lie up, Mr. Brown. For a good long while." The doctor began to clean the wound with a stinging antiseptic, his touch surprisingly deft. "You should stay right here in town. Better yet, get yourself a homestead out on that Indian strip they just opened up. Find a quiet spot, lie around for a month or two, doing absolutely nothing. Let your body fight this poison. Then, when you're stronger, you can prove up your claim." He dabbed at the wound with a piece of clean linen. "This country here has got a great future, Mr. Brown. A truly great future." He even smiled, a sudden burst of enthusiasm. "You got time to see the little garden I've planted out back. Got tomatoes coming up, something wonderful. Rip shook his head. Some other time, Doc. A homestead. The idea, so foreign to his way of life, echoed strangely in his mind. As the doctor bandaged his side with fresh linen, Rip's thoughts drifted back to the little dugout by the pothole lake, the woman and her boy, Jesse. It had been a pretty spot, sheltered with water nearby. A man could rest there, let the years run out quiet-like. A place like that, or maybe even that place, he thought with a sudden, twisted clarity, after he and Dyke had helped Bear move the current occupants along. As long as Bear and Dyke held the power in Colfax County, a man like him, a man who served their purposes, would be safe. He could even help keep them in power, ensure his own sanctuary. His head was aching worse than ever. He wished, just for a moment, that he dared ask the doctor for something to dull the pain, a dose of laudanum perhaps. But he couldn't afford to be slow-witted. Not with the business that was likely coming his way today, this Saturday. He needed his wits about him, however clouded they were by fever. He paid the doctor the 50 cents he asked for, the coin feeling light in his palm. Then, with a curt nod, he left the small house and stepped back out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight of Palouse City. His body was weak, his future uncertain, but a grim sort of resolve had settled in him. He would see this through. He had to. He made his way to the main store and took a seat on the wooden bench out front, not far from the already busy hitch rack. From there, he could watch the town come alive, watch for the players in this rigged game to make their first moves. Chapter 19. "Mornin', Deputy Brown," a passing storekeeper said, nodding curtly as he unlocked the front door of the mercantile. He squinted at Rip Campbell, who sat on the wooden bench out front, then added, "Looks to be a fine Saturday. Hope it stays quiet." Rip just touched the brim of his hat, offering no reply. Quiet. On a Saturday, in a town simmering with bad blood like Palouse City? Not likely. He'd seen it brewing since he'd arrived. Saturday was when the homesteaders came in for supplies, their wagons laden with hope and hard-earned produce. It was also when the ranch hands, full of whiskey and swagger, came looking for trouble. Today, with Bear and Sheriff Dyke clearly planning something, quiet was the last thing Rip expected. He sat on the bench, a still, watchful figure, amidst the slowly growing bustle of the town. His patched-up wound throbbed a dull, insistent rhythm beneath his new overalls, a constant reminder of his own mortality, his own precarious position in this unfolding drama. The doctor's warning from earlier that morning echoed in his mind. "You're in mighty bad shape." But there was no rest to be had, not yet. He was a player in this game, whether he liked it or not, and the first cards were already being dealt. From his vantage point, he had a clear view of the main street. He watched as Bear's riders began to drift into town, singly and in pairs. They were easy to spot, their horses finer than the farm nags, their gear more expensive, their attitudes a blend of arrogance and coiled readiness. They favored the hitch rack in front of the Pastime Saloon, Bear's unofficial headquarters, their presence a clear statement of dominance. They lounged against the porch posts, their talk loud, their laughter a little too forced, their eyes constantly scanning the street, missing nothing. Soon after, the farm wagons began to arrive. They rumbled in slowly, drawn by sturdy, patient mules or heavy-set workhorses. They came from the outlying homesteads, from the little dugouts and cabins tucked into the coulees and along the river bottoms. They carried families, men with weathered faces and calloused hands, women whose youth was already fading under the relentless sun and wind, children with wide, curious eyes. Their wagons were filled with the meager fruits of their labor, sacks of grain, crates of vegetables, perhaps a few chickens or a pig destined for sale or trade. They moved with a quiet caution, their faces a mixture of hope and apprehension as they navigated the increasingly crowded street. Rip watched them all, his gaze impartial, his expression unreadable. He was a student of human nature, an observer of the timeless patterns of conflict and survival. He saw the homesteaders casting nervous glances towards Bayer's men, saw them hurry their children along, saw them try to make themselves small, invisible. He saw Bayer's riders watching the homesteaders with open contempt, their posture a clear provocation. Around mid-morning, a ripple of heightened attention went through the men lounging outside the pastime. Rip looked up and saw him. Bayer. The rancher rode into town on a high-stepping Kentucky gelding, its coat gleaming like polished mahogany. His foreman, Parker Nichols, a grim, silent shadow, rode beside him. Bayer didn't so much as glance at his own men. His cold, piggish eyes swept the street, then settled for a long, hard moment on Rip Campbell. It was a look that was both a challenge and a reminder of who held the power here, a reminder of the dirty work that was expected. Then, with a curt nod to Nichols, Bayer dismounted and strode into the pastime, disappearing behind its swinging doors. No more than 3 minutes later, Sheriff Ted Dyke emerged from his office down the street. The tin star on his chest gleamed ostentatiously in the morning sun. He strolled with a self-important swagger, a man trying to look larger than he was. He, too, vanished into the pastime, no doubt to receive his orders from his true master. The chain of command was clear. Rip caught sight of his fellow deputies, Walters and Spear, making their own clumsy attempts at patrolling. Walters was holding forth to a couple of listless townsfolk, his voice booming, his gestures expansive. Spear plodded along beside him, his heavy shoulders slumped, his face set in its usual dull, incurious expression. They were a joke, the pair of them. Rip knew that if any real trouble started, they'd be worse than useless. He was the only real gun in Dyke's arsenal, the only one capable of enforcing Bayer's will when things got bloody. He leaned back against the rough clapboard wall of the store, the sun warm on his face despite the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He closed his eyes for a moment, the sounds of the town washing over him, the creak of wagon wheels, the nicker of horses, the distant tinny music from the saloons, the murmur of voices. It was all so familiar. He'd seen this play unfold 100 times, in 100 different towns. The names changed, the scenery shifted, but the story remained the same. Greed, power, and the inevitable brutal clash between those who had and those who wanted. The cards were shuffled and dealt. The hand was ready to be played out. These homesteaders, with their stubborn dreams and their pathetic little patches of land, they would push blindly into the stacked deck, never understanding the forces arrayed against them. They would curse Bayer, they would curse Dyke, they would curse men like him, Jake Brown, the enforcer with the cold eyes and the fast gun. They wouldn't know, couldn't know, that they were all just players in a larger, crueler game, each one uselessly playing out the hand they'd been given by a blind and indifferent fate. A little before 10 o'clock, as the sun climbed higher, baking the dust of the main street, Rip's attention was drawn to the southern end of town. 2 wagons, moving at a steady pace, were approaching from downriver. There was something about the lead wagon, something in the set of the driver's shoulders, that snagged his attention, pulling him from his grim reverie. The first act of the day's ugly drama, he sensed, was about to begin. Chapter 20. That patched canvas on the lead wagon, Rip Campbell thought, his eyes narrowing as he watched the 2 farm rigs rumble into the south end of Palouse City. And that boy. I know that wagon. A knot tightened in his gut, a cold premonition that had nothing to do with his festering wound or the morning's poor breakfast. He'd hoped, in some distant, unacknowledged part of his mind, that the woman from the Pothole Lake and her son would have had the sense to stay away from town today. But hope, he knew, was a fool's currency in a rigged game. The lead wagon drew closer, and his recognition solidified into a grim certainty. There was the woman, her blonde hair dulled by dust and sun, her face etched with a familiar anxiety as she scanned the bustling street. Beside her sat young Jesse, his eyes wide with the excitement and apprehension of a country boy in town on a Saturday. And holding the reins, his shoulders broad and set, his dark hair ruffled by the morning breeze, was the husband. Rip hadn't seen him before, but he matched the boy's earlier, fearful glance towards the horizon. This was the man of the family, tall and square-jawed, with a look of stubborn resilience about him that Rip had seen on countless other sodbusters who were fated to break their hearts and their backs against the unyielding frontier. Axel, he'd learn later, was his name. Rip watched them, a strange mixture of emotions churning within him. He remembered the taste of the beans and cornbread, the brief moment of shelter from his desperate flight. He remembered the boy's bold questions about his gun. These weren't just anonymous homesteaders anymore. They were people who had shown him a moment's kindness, however wary. And now, they were driving straight into the teeth of whatever ugly business Bear and Sheriff Dyke had cooked up. Axel, the husband, guided his team with a steady hand, his gaze sweeping the street. He didn't head for the quieter end of town, where most of the other farm wagons were clustered. Instead, he drove directly towards the hitch rack in front of the Pastime Saloon, the very heart of Bear's domain in Palouse City. The hitch rack was already crowded with cowponies, most of them bearing Bear's distinctive Cross B brand. Prominent among them, taking up more than its fair share of space, was Bear's own prized animal, a fiddle-footed Kentucky gelding with a gleaming coat and an arrogant arch to its neck. Rip leaned forward slightly on the bench, his senses suddenly on high alert. What was the farmer thinking? Axel pulled his team to a halt. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even seem to glance at the group of Bear's riders lounging on the saloon porch, their eyes suddenly fixed on him with a predatory stillness. With a calm, deliberate motion, Axel climbed down from the wagon seat. He walked to Bear's Kentucky horse, untied its reins from the hitch rack, and with a firm hand, moved the animal a few paces further down the rail. Then, just as calmly, he led his own tired workhorses into the space he had just created and secured them. A sudden, almost palpable hush fell over that section of the street. The tinny piano music from inside the Pastime seemed to falter for a beat. Bear's men on the porch straightened up, their lazy slouch replaced by a dangerous tension. Other townsfolk, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stopped their conversations, their eyes darting nervously between the quiet farmer and the glowering ranch hands. "The damned fool," Rip Campbell breathed, the words a silent exhalation of disbelief and grim understanding. "The pure damned fool. He's pushing himself harder than he has to." He knew pride. He'd seen it destroy better men than this farmer. Axel could have found another spot, could have avoided the direct confrontation. But he hadn't. He'd made his stand, a small, defiant gesture in the face of overwhelming power. He's got the wife and the boy to think about, Rip thought, his gaze flicking to the woman on the wagon seat, her face now pale, her hands gripping Jess's shoulder tightly. If he had any sense, he'd turn that wagon around and run. Get out of this county while he still can. But even as the thought formed, a weary cynicism settled over him. What difference would it really make? That stubborn pride, that refusal to be cowed, it would ride with the farmer wherever he went. It was likely what had attracted the woman to him in the first place. The very thing that had made her a wife might well make her a widow. If not here, in the dusty streets of Palouse City, then somewhere else on some other contested piece of land. It was the way of things. For a fleeting moment, Rip felt a grudging admiration for the farmer's raw courage. It was a foolish bravery, a suicidal stubbornness, but it was courage nonetheless. Then, just as quickly, the admiration was swamped by a wave of pity. No matter how brave a show Axel made of it, no matter how squarely he set his jaw, he was already beaten. The game was rigged, the outcome preordained. As if to underscore the point, the second wagon Rip had seen approaching now rumbled into view. It was occupied by two young men, brothers by the look of them, their faces ruddy and fair, likely Swedes or Norwegians new to this harsh land. They didn't stop near the pastime. Instead, they guided their team further down the street, pulling up directly in front of the hardware store. One brother held the reins while the other climbed down and headed inside. Rip saw it then. He saw Sheriff Dyke's other two deputies, Walters and Spear, who had been loitering aimlessly near the sheriff's office, suddenly straighten up. Their attention, which had been briefly focused on Axel's quiet defiance, now shifted. They exchanged a look, then began to stroll with a new, purposeful air towards the hardware store, towards the two unsuspecting young farmers. The play was clear in Rip's mind. He had seen it 100 times before, in 100 different towns, played out in 100 different ways. Different, yet always the same. The trap was baited. And now, it was about to be sprung. Chapter 21. Well now, Spear, what have we got here? Deputy Walters boomed, his voice carrying across the dusty street, loud enough for half the town to hear. He hitched his gun belt again, a nervous habit that did nothing to make him look more formidable. Looks like a couple of fresh-faced young fellas, come to town to spend their hard-earned pennies. He winked broadly at Spear, who merely grunted in response, his heavy face impassive. The two young farmer brothers, who had just emerged from the hardware store, one of them now hefting a gunny sack filled with supplies, paused at the sound of Walter's overloud greeting. They were indeed fresh-faced, with the fair skin and light hair that spoke of Scandinavian blood. Their clothes were clean but coarse, homespun and practical. They looked strong, used to hard work, but there was an air of bewildered innocence about them as they faced the two approaching lawmen. They were like young calves, Rip Campbell thought grimly from his bench across the street, stumbling into a pen with a couple of mangy coyotes. Rip watched, a cold, familiar dread coiling in his stomach. This was it. The overture to the day's ugly opera. He'd seen this script played out too many times to count. Bear wanted the homesteaders gone. Intimidation was the first verse. If that didn't work, violence was the chorus. And men like Walters and Spear were the eager, if clumsy, instruments of that violence. "Mornin', deputies," the taller of the two brothers said, his voice polite, accented. He shifted the gunny sack, his gaze flicking nervously between Walter's blustering form and Spear's silent oafish bulk. "Mornin' to you, sonny," Walters replied, his tone condescending. He sauntered closer, Spear lumbering at his side like a trained bear. Walters stopped directly in front of the young farmer, forcing him to take a step back. "Hardware store treatin' you right. Not cheatin' you boys too bad on the price of nails and wire, are they?" "No, sir," the young man said, clearly uncomfortable. "Prices seem fair enough." "Fair enough, yea." Walters chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. He nudged Spear with his elbow. "Hear that, Spear? These fellas think Palouse City is fair." He turned back to the farmer, his smile vanishing. "This here's Bear's country, son. And Mr. Bear, he ain't too fond of sodbusters plowing up his grazing land. Especially sodbusters who look like they just fell off the turnip wagon." The young farmer's face began to flush, a tide of red creeping up his neck. His brother, standing slightly behind him, shifted his weight, his hand clenching into a fist. "We ain't lookin' for no trouble, deputy," the first farmer said, his voice tight. "We just come for supplies. We got a legal claim." "Legal claim?" Walters scoffed. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near the farmer's worn boot. "The only law that matters in Colfax County, son, is Mr. Bear's law. And Mr. Bear says this land ain't for plowin'. It's for cattle. Real men's work. Not for dirt scratchers." Rip watched from across the street, his face a stony mask. The taunts were crude, predictable, designed to provoke. Walters was a bully, puffed up by the authority of his badge, enjoying the fear he could see in the young farmer's eyes. Spear just stood there, a silent, looming threat, his presence adding weight to Walter's insults. "This is free country," the second brother suddenly spoke up, his voice higher-pitched, trembling slightly with a mixture of fear and indignation. "We have a right to be here. We work hard." "Work hard?" Walters sneered. "Scratching in the dirt like gophers? Call that work?" He poked a thick finger into the first farmer's chest. "Let me tell you something, boy. This land, it don't want you. It'll break you. Just like it's broke better men than you." He leaned closer, his breath foul with the smell of stale whiskey and cheap cigars. "Why don't you and your brother just pack up your little wagon and head on back to wherever it is you crawled out from, before you get hurt?" The first farmer, the taller one, stood his ground, though Rip could see the effort it cost him. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white where he gripped the gunny sack. "We ain't leavin'," he said, his voice low and strained. "This is our home now." "Home?" Walters laughed, a harsh barking sound. "This ain't no home for your kind." He looked them up and down with exaggerated contempt. "Look at you. Soft. Probably cry to your mamas if you break a fingernail." He turned to Spear. "What do you think, Spear? They look like they could handle a real man's life out here." Spear, who had been silently observing the exchange with dull eyes, finally spoke, his voice a gravelly rumble. "They look like they smell of cow dung and cheap dreams." It was a clumsy insult, but delivered with a brutish certainty that made it sting. That was the spark. Rip saw it in the taller farmer's eyes. The slow burn of humiliation, the mounting rage, had finally reached its flashpoint. The young man's face, already flushed, turned a deep, mottled crimson. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. The hand gripping the gunny sack tightened until the knuckles were bloodless. He'd taken all the verbal abuse he could stomach. The insult to their hard work, their hopes, their very existence in this new land had pushed him over the edge. From where he sat, Rip Campbell could almost hear the snap of the young farmer's control. He'd seen that look before, countless times. It was the look of a man pushed too far, a man about to do something desperate, something foolish, something that would inevitably lead to bloodshed. The careful, cruel machinations of Bear and Dyke were bearing their rotten fruit. The trap, so crudely but effectively set by Walters and Spear, was about to spring. The sound of Spear's unmelodious bray, a triumphant mocking laugh, drifted up the street, a final goad. The farmer's brother, seeing the dangerous light in his sibling's eyes, put a restraining hand on his arm. "Eric," he pleaded, his voice hushed. "Don't. It's not worth it." But Eric, the taller brother, shook him off. His eyes were blazing now, fixed on Walters with a murderous intensity. The gunny sack slipped from his numb fingers, thudding to the dusty boardwalk. His hands were free, and they were balled into fists, ready to strike. Or, Rip thought with a sudden cold certainty, ready to reach for something far more deadly. Chapter 22. "I've had my fill of your kind of law, you tin-star bullies." Eric, the taller of the two young farmers, roared, his voice cracking with a fury that had finally overwhelmed his fear. His fair skin was now a blotchy, dangerous crimson, his eyes blazing with a righteous fire. He took a step back from Walters and Spear, his body coiling like a threatened snake. Walters, momentarily taken aback by the sudden intensity, blustered, "Now see here, sodbuster. That's no way to talk to an officer of the—" He never finished the sentence. With a desperate cry, Eric whirled and dived, not towards the deputies, but towards the farm wagon parked a few feet away at the edge of the boardwalk. His brother yelled his name, a sharp note of alarm, but it was too late. Eric scrambled between the wagon wheels, his hands searching frantically. Rip Campbell, watching from his bench across the street, felt a cold certainty grip him. He knew what the boy was after. A rifle. Hidden somewhere in that wagon was the great equalizer, the homesteaders' last desperate argument. And Rip was right. Eric emerged from beneath the wagon, a long-barreled Spencer carbine already halfway to his shoulder. He was fast, surprisingly so for a farmer. His movements were fueled by a potent cocktail of rage and desperation. Walters, his face suddenly pale beneath its usual florid sheen, made a clumsy, ineffective grab for the pistol holstered at his hip. Spear, with a bellow of surprise, lunged towards Eric's brother, who was trying to reach Eric, perhaps to stop him, perhaps to help. The street, moments before filled with the mundane sounds of a Saturday morning, erupted into sudden, violent chaos. Rip Campbell was on his feet before he even consciously registered the decision. His body moved with the ingrained, deadly efficiency of long habit. His own Colt Peacemaker seemed to leap into his hand, clearing leather in a single fluid motion that was almost too fast for the eye to follow. There was no time for thought, no time for weighing options. A farmer with a rifle, his blood up, facing down two clumsy deputies, it was a recipe for a massacre. And Rip knew, with a chilling certainty, what his role was supposed to be in this unfolding tragedy. He was Dyke's insurance. He was Bear's hammer. It was an impossibly long shot for a pistol, halfway across the width of the dusty street, with bystanders scattering and shouting. But Rip didn't hesitate. He brought the Colt up, sighted for a fraction of a second down the blued barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The roar of the .45 shattered the morning air, a brutal, definitive sound. Eric, the Spencer nearly at his shoulder, ready to fire, suddenly cried out, a sharp, agonized sound. He spun around, as if struck by an invisible fist, the carbine flying from his grasp. It clattered uselessly onto the boardwalk. The heavy slug from Rip's Colt had caught him high in the right shoulder, a crippling, disabling shot rather than a killing one. He stumbled, his face a mask of shock and pain, and collapsed in a heap near the rear wheel of his wagon. For a stunned moment, an almost unnatural silence descended, broken only by Eric's ragged groans. Then Walters, who had finally managed to drag his own pistol free, stood gaping, a foolish, almost giddy smile plastered on his face as he looked down at the weapon in his hand, as if surprised it had actually appeared. Spear, who had managed to grab Eric's younger brother, looked equally stunned, his dull eyes wide with a bewildered shock, as if a game of taunts had suddenly exploded into something far beyond his comprehension or control. Eric's brother, with a furious cry, slammed his elbows back into Spear's thick gut, breaking the bigger man's hold. He scrambled to his fallen sibling's side. Eric, are you hurt bad? A woman, young and dark-haired, her face pale with terror, suddenly darted from the small crowd that had gathered at a safe distance. She rushed to Eric's side, her skirts rustling. Eric. Oh dear God, Eric, she cried, kneeling beside him. Eric grimaced, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Smashed my shoulder, he gasped, his voice tight with pain. Rip Campbell was already moving, striding purposefully across the street, his Colt still held loosely at his side, an aura of cold, deadly authority emanating from him. The other townsfolk melted back as he approached, their eyes wide with fear and a kind of grim fascination. He reached the small, desperate knot of people around the fallen farmer. Hold it! Rip's voice cut through the confusion, sharp and commanding as the crack of a whip. Walters and Spear, who looked about to do something foolish, froze. Rip ignored them. He looked down at Eric, his face impassive. There's a doctor 4 doors up the street on the other side, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Get that shoulder of yours seen to. He paused, then delivered the cold, hard decree, the words sounding like stones dropping into a deep, dark well. After that, you and your brother here either get your wagon rollin' and get yourselves clean out of Colfax County, or you stand trial for assaultin' a peace officer with a deadly weapon. The young woman kneeling beside Eric looked up at Rip, her dark eyes blazing with a sudden, furious hatred. Her face, moments before pale with fear, was now flushed with outrage. "Peace, officer," she spat, her voice trembling with a potent mixture of grief and fury. "You call this keeping the peace, you hired dog?" Her gaze was like a physical blow, full of contempt and a loathing so profound it momentarily silenced even the blustering Walters. Chapter 23. "He was provoked, I tell you," the young woman beside the fallen Eric cried out, her voice shrill with anguish and fury. She glared at Rip Campbell, her dark eyes flashing. "Those two louts you call deputies, they pushed him. They insulted him. He was just defending his honor. You shot him down like a dog." Rip Campbell stood impassive, his Colt still held loosely at his side, the smoke from its recent discharge a faint acrid perfume in the air. He offered no defense, no explanation. His orders had been clear. Handle any homesteader who fought back. Eric had reached for a rifle. He had handled it. Then another voice, raw with a deeper, more personal betrayal, cut through the tense atmosphere. "So it is you. You are one of Bayer's pet curs." Rip turned his head slightly. The woman from the Pothole Lake, Jess's mother, had pushed her way through the small, frightened knot of onlookers. Her face, which had shown him a moment's weary kindness, was now contorted with a loathing so profound it was like a physical blow. Her blue eyes, faded by sun and hardship, now blazed with a righteous fire that seemed to sear him. "I knew it," she choked out, her voice trembling with emotion. "I knew no good could come of a man who looked like you. I'm sorry I wasted good food on you the other day, you snake. I should have saved it for the hogs. They're better company than the likes of you. There's no reason, no earthly reason, for a man like you to keep on living." Her words struck Rip with a force greater than any bullet. He looked at her blankly, his own face an unreadable mask, but beneath the stoic exterior, something unfamiliar, something akin to shame, flickered briefly. He remembered the taste of her beans, the rough shelter of her dugout. He remembered the boy, Jesse, and his innocent questions. Before he could formulate a reply, even if he'd had one, Sheriff Ted Dyke swaggered onto the scene, arriving importantly from the direction of the Pastime Saloon. He had a self-satisfied smirk on his weasel-like face. He took in the fallen farmer, the distraught women, the silent, watchful crowd, and Rip Campbell standing like a grim sentinel. "A little trouble here, Jake?" Dyke asked, his tone light, almost jovial, as if this were nothing more than a minor street disturbance. Rip's gaze remained fixed on the furious woman, but he answered Dyke, his voice flat. "Our friend here," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the groaning Eric, "went for Deputy Spear and Deputy Walters with a rifle. I had to cool him off a mite." Dyke didn't even glance at the wounded farmer. His eyes, cold and calculating, settled on Jess's mother. "Ma'am," he said, his voice suddenly hard, devoid of its earlier false bonhomie, "we are giving you and all other troublemakers in Colfax County the same orders." He paused for effect, letting his authorities sink in. "Get your wagon loaded and rolling. And don't you stop this side of the county line." The woman drew herself up, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a towering indignation. "So that's it, is it?" she demanded, her voice ringing with bitter scorn. "We just move out, and tomorrow you or some other scavenging dog of Bayer's files a claim on our land. The land we broke our backs to clear? The land we poured our sweat and blood into?" Her eyes flashed. "Why even bother pretending this is legal, Sheriff? Why not just kill us all outright and get it over with?" Dyke's smirk didn't waver. "Lady," he said, his voice cold and final, "you've heard what I have to say. I suggest you listen." With a choked sob, the woman turned away, tears of helpless rage and despair streaking the fine layer of dust on her face. Rip watched her. He saw young Jesse, who had been standing a few feet away, his small face pale, his eyes wide and frightened by the raw, adult emotions swirling around him. The boy reached out a tentative hand and clutched his mother's skirt, seeking comfort in her presence. Well, Rip thought, a familiar cynicism rising within him, it's a tough, unforgiving world. The boy might as well learn that lesson now as later. Yet, for some reason, the thought brought him no satisfaction, only a deeper weariness. His head was beginning to feel light again, the fever from his wound pulsing behind his eyes, making the scene shimmer and waver. He saw the woman's husband, Axel, the tall, dark-haired farmer who had so boldly moved Bear's horse, stride quickly to his wife's side. She turned and buried her face in his shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. Axel held her close for a moment, his own face a grim mask of controlled fury and helplessness. Young Jesse stood beside them, his small hands still clutching his mother's dress, his eyes reflecting a bewildered terror that outstripped any of his wildest boyhood dreams of Indian battles or outlaw raids. This was real. This was ugly. And it was happening to his family. Finally, Axel gently pushed his wife away. He said something to her, in a low, urgent tone that Rip couldn't hear. Then, his face set in lines of grim, desperate resolve, he wheeled around and began to stride purposefully, not towards his wagon, but towards the pastime saloon. Towards Bear. It was then, as the farmer turned, that Rip Campbell saw it. Tucked into the waistband of Axel's denim overalls, the worn wooden butt of a pistol was clearly visible. The last card, Rip thought, his blood suddenly running cold despite the fever. The last card was about to be played. Chapter 2014. Well now, Brown, Sheriff Ted Dyke drawled, a smirk playing on his thin lips as he watched Axel the farmer stride with grim determination towards the pastime saloon. Looks like our sodbuster friend has a burr under his saddle. Reckon he aims to have a serious talk with Mr. Bear. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Some folks just never learn when they're beat. Rip Campbell said nothing. His gaze was fixed on Axel's rigid back, on the almost imperceptible bulge at his waistband where Rip knew a pistol was tucked. He saw Bear and his foreman, Harker Nichols, appear in the shadowed doorway of the pastime. They stood there, arms crossed, watching Axel's approach with expressions of bored contempt, like men observing an insect crawling towards a boot heel. It was all playing out, Rip thought with a weary internal sigh, just as he'd known it would. Every move, every player slotting into their preordained place. The last card in a long, crooked game had been dealt. The design, ugly and brutal, was complete. There was no escape for the farmer. He was walking into his own grave, driven by a pride that would be his undoing. And Rip himself, he was just another pawn in their game, the hired gun meant to deliver the final, fatal blow. As Axel reached the edge of the saloon's boardwalk, his hand drifting instinctively towards his concealed weapon, Dyke's voice cut through the tense air, sharp and commanding. "All right, Brown. That farmer's armed. Don't let him get any closer to Mr. Bear. Take him. Use your gun." Rip Campbell's hand moved, a blur of practiced motion, towards the Colt peacemaker at his hip. The worn walnut grip felt cool and familiar beneath his fingers. He drew the weapon, its blued steel glinting dully in the Saturday morning sun. He could feel the eyes of everyone on the street fixed on him. Dyke, Bear, Nichols, the terrified homesteaders, the stunned townsfolk. They all expected him to gun down the defiant farmer, to put an end to this inconvenient challenge to Bear's authority. He lifted the Colt, its barrel coming up, steady despite the fever that still coursed through his veins. He could see Axel clearly, could see the desperate resolve etched on his face. He could almost feel the man's thudding heartbeat, the surge of adrenaline that was propelling him towards a suicidal confrontation. And in that stretched, silent moment, with the fate of the farmer hanging precariously in the balance, something within Rip Campbell finally snapped. It wasn't a single thing. It was an accumulation. The memory of the woman's kindness at the pothole lake, her face contorted with loathing as she'd called him Bear's dog. Young Jess's wide, frightened eyes. The quiet, stubborn dignity of this doomed farmer, Axel, walking to certain death for a principle. The reek of corruption from Dyke, the blatant arrogance of Bear. His own weary disgust with the endless, repetitive cycle of violence and injustice, and his own damnation as a tool in that cycle. A lifetime of being fate's whipping boy, of playing out hands he hadn't dealt, suddenly coalesced into a single white-hot point of rebellion. This was it. His chance. His one, perhaps last, chance to spit in the eye of destiny, to upend the rigged game, to choose his own damn cards for once. Instead of leveling his pistol at Axel, Rip Campbell turned, his movement swift and unexpected as a striking rattler. His cold, flinty gaze locked onto Sheriff Ted Dyke. Dyke. Rip's voice was a low, deadly snarl, cutting through the charged silence. You always did fancy yourself a fast hand with that iron. Faster than old Shorty Moorcross ever was, you used to boast. He saw the flicker of surprise, then confusion in Dyke's weasel eyes. Well, now's your chance to prove it, you back-shootin' son of a bitch. Dyke stared, his jaw slack, his mind struggling to comprehend the sudden, shocking shift in the script. Brown. What in the blue blazes are you talking about? He stammered, his hand hovering uncertainly near his own holstered gun. I'm changing sides, Sheriff. Rip spat the word like a curse. Consider my resignation. The realization, the full, terrible import of Rip's betrayal, finally hit Dyke. His eyes widened in a mixture of fury and dawning fear. His hand, which had been hesitating, now clawed desperately for his pistol. He was fast, driven by panic and the instinct for self-preservation. The gun was halfway clear of its holster, the barrel beginning to rise. But Rip Campbell, even wounded, even feverish, was a different order of being when a gun was in his hand. He was death incarnate, a blur of cold, focused motion. His Colt, which had never wavered from its alignment with Dyke's chest, roared once, the sound a flat, brutal punctuation mark in the stunned silence of the street. Ted Dyke jerked violently, as if an invisible rope had snapped him backward. A dark, blossoming stain appeared on his throat, just above the tarnished tin star. His eyes, moments before filled with confused rage, now held only a vast, uncomprehending surprise. He made a gurgling sound, his hands flying to his neck, trying to staunch the sudden, shocking eruption of his own lifeblood. His gun clattered from his nerveless fingers. He stumbled a step, then another. Then his legs buckled beneath him, and he pitched forward into the dust of Palouse City, dead before he even hit the ground. Rip Campbell stood for a fraction of a second, his Colt smoking in his hand, the acrid scent of burnt powder sharp in his nostrils. Then, with the same deadly speed, he whirled, his eyes blazing with a cold, lethal fire, to face the two remaining deputies, Walters and Spear, who stood frozen in a mixture of terror and disbelief. Chapter 25. No trouble from us, Brown. Deputy Walters stammered, his face the color of dirty parchment. His bravado had vanished, leaving behind a quivering jelly of a man. He held his hands up, palms out, in a gesture of abject surrender. We're peaceful as newborn lambs, ain't we, Spear? Spear, his heavy face slack with a mixture of terror and disbelief, could only manage a jerky nod. His eyes were fixed on the smoking Colt in Rip Campbell's hand, then on the still, crumpled form of Sheriff Ted Dyke bleeding out into the dust. Then stay that way, Rip Campbell snarled, his voice like splintered ice. One twitch, one wrong move from either of you, and you'll join your brave sheriff in hell before you can draw another breath. His gaze, cold and lethal, pinned them where they stood. He meant every word, and they knew it. Satisfied that Walters and Spear were no longer an immediate threat, Rip shifted his attention. His eyes, burning with fever and a newfound terrible clarity, swung towards the Pastime Saloon. Bear and his foreman, Parker Nichols, stood frozen in the shadowed doorway, their faces masks of stunned outrage and dawning alarm. They had witnessed Dyke's sudden, shocking demise, had seen this hired gun, this Jake Brown, turn on his own employer. Rip didn't hesitate. He was running on raw nerve and the last dregs of his adrenaline. He knew Bear wouldn't stay shocked for long. The rancher was a cornered wolf, and cornered wolves were always dangerous. Rip's first shot was not aimed at Bear. It kicked up a spout of dust a foot in front of Axel the farmer, who still stood bewildered near the saloon boardwalk, his own pistol half drawn. "Get down, farmer." Rip barked, the words a harsh command. Axel, startled, instinctively dropped to a crouch. Rip's second shot was for Bear. It splintered the wooden doorframe of the pastime, inches from the rancher's florid face, sending a shower of raw wood flying. Bear yelped, a sound of pure, undignified terror, and he and Nichols stumbled backwards, disappearing into the saloon's dim interior. That wasn't enough for Rip. He knew men like Bear. Give them a moment to think, a moment to rally, and they'd come out spitting lead. He strode forward a few paces, his Colt bucking in his hand as he emptied its remaining rounds through the flimsy batwing doors of the pastime. Wood splintered, glass shattered from within. He heard shouts, a crash, then a satisfying silence. If he judged Bear right, and he usually judged men like Bear with deadly accuracy, the big rancher would be hugging the sawdust-strewn floor for a good long while, counting his blessings and cursing the name of Jake Brown. Then, the strength, the artificial energy that had fueled his desperate actions, began to drain out of him like water from a sieve. A profound weariness settled over him, so heavy it was an effort to remain standing. The fever, which had been a dull throb, now flared, sending waves of dizziness and nausea through him. His wounded side was a solid sheet of fire. It took every ounce of his remaining willpower to force his leaden feet to move towards the hitch rack, where Bear's fine Kentucky gelding was dancing nervously, its eyes wide with fright from the gunfire. Axel the farmer had risen from his crouch. He still held his pistol, but his face was a study in utter confusion. He looked from the dead Sheriff Dyke to the bullet-riddled saloon doors, then to Rip Campbell, who was fumbling with the reins of Bear's horse. Rip ignored him for the moment. He turned to the woman, Jess's mother, who stood nearby, her son still clinging to her skirts. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, no longer with fury at him, but with a dazed, uncomprehending shock. "Ma'am," Rip said, his voice raspy, the effort of speaking almost too much. "You need to get word to the United States Marshal. Up at Spokane Falls." He paused, gathering his breath. "You tell him what happened here. Tell him that Rancher Bear had Shorty Moorcross and a gunman named Rip Campbell in his pay as lawdogs trying to run homesteaders off their land. He used his real name and Shorty's old one. Let the federal law sort through that particular tangle." The woman stared at him, her lips parted. "But why?" she finally whispered, and he knew she wasn't asking about the message to the marshal. She was asking about him, about his sudden, inexplicable change of sides. Rip Campbell looked away, towards the distant rolling Palouse hills, green and gold under the late morning sun. "I don't rightly know, ma'am," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I don't know exactly." He paused, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Mighty pretty place you got there, though. By that little lake." He turned then, and with a grunt of pain, hauled himself into the saddle of Bear's Kentucky horse. The animal was spirited, well-fed, a stark contrast to the broken-down mounts he'd ridden recently. It sidestepped, eager to run. Rip gathered the reins, his hands surprisingly steady. He pointed the horse towards the northern rim of the valley, towards the place where the tall grass grew, the place where the wind sang its song of distant waterfalls. Beyond that lay Idaho, and a slim chance of finding a spring, a hidden place where he could rest, where he could try to fight the fire that was consuming him. The horse, he figured, could find its own way back to Bear's ranch eventually. Or maybe it wouldn't. He didn't much care. The fever was burning high in his blood now, making the world shimmer and tilt. A strange, almost giddy lightness filled his head. He looked back just once at the dusty street of Palouse City, at the small, stunned group of homesteaders, at the dead sheriff, at the saloon that sheltered the cowering cattle king. A grin, wide and unexpectedly boyish, spread across Rip Campbell's gaunt, fever-flushed face. It didn't matter if the cards were marked, he thought. It didn't matter if the game was rigged from the start. A man, if he had the nerve, if he had the grit, could still reach out and upset the whole damn deal. He could still play a hand of his own choosing. He touched his heels to the Kentucky horse's flanks, and the animal surged forward, carrying him away from Palouse City, away from his past, towards an uncertain future, a lone rider against a vast, indifferent sky. The end.